Good morning, everybody. We are so happy to welcome you to day 2 of the Nearshore Summit and Synthesis. My name is 𝗕𝗃 𝗏, and I'm the Science Manager for the Estuary and Salmon Restoration Program at the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. And I'm also the chair of the Puget Sound Ecosystem Monitoring Program's Nearshore Work Group. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered together but apart on Coast Salish ancestral homelands. I am speaking from Olympia, Washington, which occupies the traditional territories of the 𝗲𝘂𝗏 𝗧𝗏 and 𝗂𝗏 peoples, whose ancestors resided here from time immemorial and who still thrive today. We respect and uphold the Coast Salish peoples as sovereign nations and as knowing bodies and defining partners in our effort to improve the integrity and resilience of ecosystem processes that support environmental and human health and well-being. Welcome, everyone. We are so glad to be here today. And as we gather in this virtual space, I wanted to orient everyone to our rules of the Zoom road, Zoom rules of the road for today. So first of all, settle in, enjoy yourself. This is going to be really fun. We've got some really, really good speakers, and we are just so excited to put on this summit. Second, give yourself permission, if you can, to unplug from other things. If you can, turn off your email, mute your phone, just really be prepared to soak it in and enjoy. If you have a technical issue or a question for the summit organizers, please use the chat function. And then let's see, sorry. Okay, and then if you have a question for a speaker, please try to use the Q&A function. Unless you are a panelist, if you are on the meeting as a panelist, as a speaker, either today or another day, you can use the chat to ask questions because the Q&A function is not available to panelists. We will be monitoring the Q&A and the chat, and we will be leaving time after every talk for Q&A. We also invite panelists as they're able, the speakers, if there are questions directed to you, to answer them in writing if there's not time between the talks. And we also would encourage people to write the name of the speaker that the question is directed to so that we can more easily do that. Speakers, please mute yourself and have your video off when you are not speaking. That way we can really focus on the person speaking. And speakers, you will share your screens during presentations, although we do have a backup of everyone's presentation just in case. Jason will unmute. Jason 𝗕𝗃 will be our moderator today, and he will let you know that there's 2 minutes left at 10 minutes into each speaker's talk. And then at 12 minutes, Jason will unmute and play an authoritative but not unpleasant beeping alarm, and he'll also turn his video on. We will have a break this morning where we can have an opportunity to interact informally. And this is something that we're trying to do to sort of emulate maybe the hallway of a conference where you can kind of move yourself over to anyone you like, other attendee or speaker, and start a conversation. And I'll give more instructions about this when it's time for the break, but just know that we are creating some very informal, it's not orchestrated or facilitated in any way, just a place for people to interact. So we wanted to introduce our principles for this meeting. We have a very interdisciplinary and diverse set of perspectives that we've invited, and our job is to collectively create a space that is respectful and open, and we ask that we all do this together. We have a huge thanks to our steering committee. This amazing group of people has really helped us to define the questions for the summit and to create a vision for the structure and makeup of the summit that you see. So we thank 𝗏𝗏, Megan Detier, Jennifer Griffiths, Devin Smith, Chris Ellings, Simone DesRoches, Doris Small, Sydney Fishman, Dawn Pucci, and Paul Cheragino. Just really grateful for the advice and support of this great group. And then I want to introduce our summit planning team. So this group of people has been working really hard to make sure everything runs smoothly and to plan this summit. So we've got Lindsay Desmuel, Jenna Jewett, Darren Williams, 𝗵𝗵𝗁𝗂, myself with my cat, I don't know if you can see her, but she's right back there, 𝗕𝗏𝗃𝗏, 𝗂𝗃 and Jason 𝗏 will be our moderator today. So just to orient you to the sort of the overall summit makeup, we were trying to spare everyone a little bit of Zoom fatigue. And so we have 2 days that have ample breaks. And today we're on day 2 of beaches. Next week, we'll be doing deltas. And then the week after that, we'll be doing embayments. And it's Wednesday, Thursday of each week. So I feel humbled and inspired by the expertise, perspective, and knowledge encompassed by the amazing speakers that we have lined up for this summit. And I encourage everyone to browse the program and read their full biographies. We've got 78 individuals from over 50 organizations, state, local, regional, federal, tribal, nonprofit, private, and academic, just a great breadth of experience there. Each of these people were individually invited by us to reflect contributions from natural scientists, from restoration practitioners and planners, and from social scientists, including experts in diversity, equity, and inclusion, to help us think about how we can better incorporate these principles into our restoration work. So how did we get here? The idea for this summit really started from conversations between myself and Jason 𝗏 with the Nearshore work group as part of the Puget Sound ecosystem monitoring program, and the Estuary and Salmon restoration program at WDFW with Jason 𝗂𝗃𝗏𝗁𝗂. And we really thank the 𝗵𝗃 for the funding to help turn this from an idea to a reality. So what are our overall summit objectives? First of all, we'd like to synthesize nearshore restoration science. We want to capture insights from restoration practice. We want to identify the most important science and management questions to guide future actions, update PSNERP conceptual models as appropriate, and incorporate social science principles, including diversity, equity, and inclusion into the work that we do. So to get at this, we invited each speaker, and then we said, we want you to talk about something that helps us to answer these specific questions posed towards each group. So we curated a set of questions designated for each group of speakers. So for the natural scientists, we asked, what are the key implications of your research for planning or implementing process-based restoration? Okay. We asked for you, what are the most important uncertainties to address with future research that will result in more effective restoration? And then we asked how or does your work improve or inform upon these PSNERP conceptual models for restoration, looking at actions and effects? For social scientists, we asked, what does your social science field or area of expertise contribute or add value to planning or restoration? What are major social science gaps and needs that you observe or experience within your field or area? And what needs to be done in order for you and your research to be better integrated into practitioners or natural science researchers' work? For restoration practitioners and planners, we asked, what have you learned through your experience with project development, design, or implementation that informs the needs of future restoration? For you, what are the most important scientific uncertainties, natural or social, that limit planning, designing, implementing, or evaluating nearshore restoration? And so what you see is we've really created a blend of all of these disciplines in the lineup that you see. So this is just this morning's lineup. And we are so excited to really try to break down any interdisciplinary silos and sort of get everyone listening to one another. So what we really are trying to do is bring together restoration practitioners and scientists to share what we've learned, the questions we have, and chart a course for the next generation of restoration and research, and then share this with the regional restoration entities and anyone whose work may be informed by this effort. Okay, Jim, I'm glad to see you.
Yeah, long story. Thanks, Jay.
Okay. Ooh, okay, awesome. So with that, I'm going to pass the reins over to Jim Johannesson, who is our first speaker, and to Jason 𝗏, who will be moderating today.
Hi all, it's me, Jason, and I'll speak for a moment while Jim gets home from school. And it looks like he's about home from school, and he's going to tell us what he learned on the way home from school. So there you go, Jim, take it away. And Jim, maybe since we just logged on at 10 minutes, I'll say something, and at 12 minutes, you'll hear it being, and my video feed will turn on again.
Okay, that sounds good. That sounds good. Let me get the screen. So I'm going to speak to you today about lessons from the beach on my way home from school. It's been a long schooling. Puget Sound coastal restoration design considerations. And this will be for both design as well as how we actually get these projects done from even things like guidance and coordination. So pretty broad. We've been doing these projects for over 20 years. I've been consulting for 30 years in the area and spending a tremendous amount of time on beaches since I was just a kid. So trying to give you the long-term perspective. This was one of the true restoration projects looking at sea level rise, looking at how to make an adaptive project going into the future that can have natural processes do what they will with sea level rise. Change is constant, it's coming faster than ever, and I don't think we're quite up to the task at present. We need to increase our pace, get ready for these projects, for these sea level rise, and act accordingly. We know sea level rise accelerating. We don't know the rates. We know the Arctic and the Antarctic are melting faster than anybody ever predicted. Increased storminess appears to be happening. How much will that increase recession and erosion? This necessitates moving forward with different planning. So this is just a quick example photo from where the shoreline has been moving landward, particularly the vegetation line. I've watched this area for decades, and in the last 5+ years, we've seen that entire 15+ feet of vegetation moving landward, with storms getting higher and into the backshore, and the entire Rose group has been shifted landward about that distance. So we know things are accelerating. We know that we're going to need more land to do proper projects. We're going to need more money to do that, to do restoration. I'm going to argue that we need to agree on planning horizons for projects. Are we designing for 25 years? Are we designing for 75 years? Huge difference in sea level rise scenarios. Larger stream flows are certainly in our future, bigger peak discharge, greater surface water erosion along with that. We need to plan for greater stress on revegetation efforts and getting these plants established. Drier summers are certainly in our future as well. A couple of quick examples. I'm not going to go into the details with these so much, but I'm going to tell you what we need to look for in project planning and design and outreach and so on. This is a project on Orcas Island, the 𝗵𝘃, creosoted wood, lots of fill, particularly armor more than fill. These owners were willing to pull back. So they're willing to lose the armor. They're willing to plan for sea level rise. So we worked through the science, the slopes and everything else. The more distance they were going to give up, the more longevity without erosion or maintenance the project was going to have. So they wanted to plan long-term, and they could afford it. We brought everything back in steps, benched the slope down to a realistic slope, long-term stable. And here's the result. Friends of the San Juans helped put a little bit of habitat value on top of this, which is otherwise a private project. A holistic and a long-term vision is needed. So I'm going to throw in a few of these kind of lessons learned as we go. This makes the sea level rise accommodation possible. And these folks could afford it. So again, the finances are necessary as well if we want to do things the way they should be. So this is an example. I'll show you just a few other quick examples that make lessons that we can use going forward. Bellingham, and this is the old Georgia Pacific project and all of its pollution glory back in 1975. The project site, we're kind of using this site, just little pieces at a time are getting done. So this is a highly contaminated site, and all sorts of creosoted wood in it as well, fill over the old mud flat. So this little Waypoint Park area was targeted for an early action, and this was a few years ago. So the cleanup was done in this area. The fill was going to come out, so we helped step in and get rid of all the old stuff and the design for the new. Beach nourishment was after the fill was removed. So the main thing here is 𝗏𝗵 recently was at that time was working on a new sea level rise guidance. So they've adopted a 50-inch sea level rise, so 4 feet and 2 inches. So through that, we were able to, say, okay, well, this is truly needs to provide accommodation space. We brought the beach up pretty straightforward, not really process recommendation, but putting the habitats back in place. Excuse me. So the accommodation space was there. The park users certainly enjoy it as well. So specific sea level rise guidance really helped in this case, and I think getting it statewide, if not at a federal level, will help all of us play on the same playing field and hopefully planning longer term. The long-term vision is really what makes this possible, and having the space to give up is certainly part of it. Now, of course, we always argue you're not giving it up, you're transitioning it to a beach or a natural shoreline. So project in stages. So there's been a few planning stages out on Lopez Island, Agate Beach. This is on South Lopez, San Juan County. And this is a site where the road access is quite constricted. You come down off the uplands and the highlands, you cross a very, very low Barlow Bay Beach, and then you come around Agate Beach, which has been eroding for decades. Huge amounts of armor that are slated for removal now in a project that's going to happen in the next 1 to 2 years. And the road is going to go landward in the short term around the park. And we've got even a better longer term vision I'll show you after this. Current conditions, we're down to 1 lane in places. So an example of one of the many roads that has been or will be moved back. So the big flow is to try to get the road off of both of these beaches. This will be hopefully the future phase that will continue off of an older project San Juan County started in 2016 to bring the road down and around and keep it on the high elevation shores altogether. Possibly up the alley, but this is yet to be determined to avoid both of these coastal roads that are failing. This has had a big stakeholder outreach process for years and a lot of engagement. The federal Department of Transportation is working on this now. We've got Central Washington U working and other groups here and there. So once we were able to provide site-specific erosion rates, inundation, what are the changes that are going to come without a project, things look pretty attractive to plan and work for a long-term project for the Lopez Island folks and the county. Kayak Point is another small project, well, another big project that's been in planning for many years. Lots of flood damage and erosion. So this is going to be an example of the largest sea level rise accommodation by raising elevations. We've looked for sort of the worst case. Well, we don't know if it's the worst case. We look for a higher sea level rise, both in a conceptual and more of an engineering term. I think this is the key is, what's the site-specific changes that are expected? What are the real-term erosion rates? What do they be in the future? What are the water levels? Again, just breezing through these, this entire park will be raised, and this will be a 2022 project if all goes according to plans, and then the second bigger phase, 2024. This is led by J.A. Brennan and Associates, along with Snohomish County Parks. So there's the concept is to go up from existing grade, a new storm berm above and behind the current active beach. And then the fills be pretty extensive. We're up to 3.7 feet of fill in the dark blue areas. So a lot of adjustments up. Again, planning horizon is essential here. And then again, here just a quick, just to make sure you're all aware, we're doing a study now with Ian Miller with Sea Grant, looking at sea level rise parcel-wide all around sound. This is starting with all existing data and doing a GIS framework compatible with beach strategies data, looking at flood exposure, looking at different scenarios so we can see what happens with sea level rise, and going into the future all the way up through 2100. Some pretty pictures. That's what we've got. So we'd be about another year on this project. So the lessons learned, what we're trying to do is some of these points here from my project examples. We're only seeing the beginning of this, and we do need to accommodate a lot more. We've got some examples. We need a lot more going forward. It's going to take persistent planning and doing the geomorphic geological work to get to the engineering. It's going to take engagement, stakeholder process, lots of continued and ongoing engagement. And again, how far we're planning for. We should try to be clear and consistent on that. The uncertainties, I think we need to know the magnitudes of sea level rise. That's going to be the hardest one to know. The degree of increased storminess, how much that's going to be changing. We haven't seen a lot published on this lately. I think we need to catch up on that front as well. Natural and altered littoral transport rates are pretty crucial, and we need to see what the sediment budgets are going to. Well, first we need to know what they are naturally. We're behind in this, and then we need to figure out what they're going to be in the new paradigm.
1 minute, Jim.
What was that, Jason? 1 or 2?
1 minute.
Okay, thanks. So littoral transport rates we need to know. And what's the site-specific erosion and accretion? That's where the real detail work comes in. So wrapping up here, last slide. What are the action needs as I see them, as we see them? We need to be more realistic. We need to be more blunt with people, as Lisa Kaufman was saying yesterday. We need to plan long-term. Planning for the next 10 years, 20 years isn't really practical. We need that accommodation space. Larger budgets are needed for this. If we're going to acquire land, if we're going to move buildings and drain fields and everything else, we need that kind of budget to be realistic. Our materials costs are going up. We see that for gravel and sand. We see that for wood, all the engineering considerations beyond these. This will need to come in through budgets, like I said, and then site-specific design is really what we're after. We could have a federal guidance, as a few people in the Corps of Engineers are arguing for. What's the sea level rise we should all be planning for? In lieu of that, state guidance, I think, would be tremendous. With that, I will yield to the beautiful faces on the screen. Thank you, guys.
Thanks so much, Jim. Great talk. And we have some questions coming in. So Jen will be asking the questions this morning, and I encourage people to type them in, because if we don't get to them now, which we won't get to all of them, Jim and any speaker has the opportunity to type in a response as well.
Awesome. Good morning. The first one is from Ron. He asks, is NOAA the best source of documenting sea level rise rates and changes in mean sea level in our region? And where can we find predicted rise rates?
Yeah, the Washington Coastal Resilience Project has done a lot of work in the region up through 2018, led by Sea Grant. And so they've done site-specific adjustments for vertical land motion and other factors. NOAA's got, of course, federal guidance. So the Washington Coastal Resilience would be the place to go. And as Ian Miller has said, and everybody else acknowledges, these will need to be adjusted in the future with new global projections as well.
Great. Lisa has a question. She says this project was an old paper mill site. Was there soil toxin tests and cleanup done? Okay, so
that must be the GP site in Bellingham. Yeah, there was a large team, and there still is a team of the cleanup, and they were responsible for going to get our lower surface. So they were responsible to help bring the fill level down safely and then cap it again. And then we built on top of that. Same thing we're doing now at Port Gamble Mill. Same thing we're doing at Boulevard Park in North Bellingham. And so it's a team process. Yeah, I was just showing you the coastal parts.
Okay. Jason, do we have time for one quick one?
Sure, go for one more quick one. And Brittany, if you want to start sharing your screen while that's happening, that'd be great.
Okay. David asks, how do we measure success from these projects?
How do we measure success? That's a good question, isn't it? We measure success in the short term. We do, when we're lucky, we get to do 3 years or 5 years of monitoring. We really need, look at what we're talking about. We need to be measuring into 20 and 50 years to really see if we succeeded with some of these. But generally, it's the habitats when that's the focus are coming back. The maintenance costs are very, very low. The erosion, the adaptive management needs are very low. Each project has different goals, so you need to adjust accordingly. Certainly, we throw in there's no contaminants for those sites as well.
Awesome, thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Great talk and great questions, everyone. And if Brittany King is around there, which I see.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Brittany King, and today I'm going to be talking to you all about a project that I'm working on with the Northwest Fisheries Science Center, which is looking at ecological and social influences of salmon habitat restoration efforts in the Puget Sound. And just for a little background information about me, I'm a PhD candidate. I'm a social scientist, and my research looks at diversity, equity, and inclusion in fishery science professions with a focus on race and ethnicity, but I also look at other things. So what I'm going to be talking to you all about today is going to be coming from a diversity and inclusion lens. So when I was thinking about how I wanted to organize my presentation, I started with this idea of looking at the objectives of the conference. And I felt that, for some reason I fell within this one, which looked at developing and incorporating social science principles, including diversity, equity, inclusion, into conceptual models of nearshore restoration. And a lot of times when I think about diversity, equity, and inclusion with restoration or with the project that I'm working on, I'm looking at it from this lens of environmental justice. And so environmental justice focuses on, for any of those of you who don't know, the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of their backgrounds, in the development, implementation, enforcement of environmental laws and regulations. And so when we think about restoration projects and environmental justice, I'm interested in how everyone is included in the process of deciding where projects are benefiting from where projects are. Environmental justice highlights that environmental hazards may disproportionately affect some communities that are greater susceptible to unequal environmental protection. However, a lot of times when we look at the environmental impacts and social impacts, they're looked at separately, and our research doesn't put them together. So we'll see, like, what are the environmental impacts of salmon restoration, and we'll look at all the environmental indicators. And we may potentially look at social impacts, but a lot of times they aren't considered together. And so that's something that I'm really interested in, and our project looks at. So one of the background papers that we based our project off of was this paper by Stanford et al. That came out a couple years ago, and they wanted to see where and why did restoration happen, and they weren't focused specifically on salmon restoration, but just restoration in California. And they put the two variables that I just mentioned, ecological and social characteristics, together to look at stream restoration in California. And what they found was restoration was highest in areas where with water quality impairment, high population density, pro-environmental voting, high education, and in wealthy non-Hispanic white populations. And so when we were looking at this paper, a co-author, also my mentor, Robbie from Northwest Fisheries Science Center, we wanted to see if similar trends that were found in this paper exist in the Pacific Northwest, and specifically in the Puget Sound region, but also just to see if there's any other social variables that we can look at to start seeing if there's any correlations or relationships to where salmon habitat restoration projects were placed in social variables. So our research question was, does regional distribution of completed salmon habitat restoration work sites correlate with biological, physical, and human community characteristics? And what we use for our research is moving my database is the Pacific Northwest Salmon Habitat Restoration Project database, which is a database that's managed by Northwest Fisheries Science Center. And within this database, it contains over 26,000 restoration actions that have taken place at over 42,000 locations and work sites in the past 15 years, or a little over 15 years. And this is all in the Pacific Northwest. But if we get a little more specific and look at the Puget Sound region, it contains over 1,500 restoration actions at over 21,000 locations from 2000 to 2015. And so that's the timeline we're looking at. So when we look at restoration projects, we're looking at projects that have already existed or already been put into place and seeing what those connections were around that time. So just to give you an idea of our study site, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with it, but we are looking at the Puget Sound region, and we are using the number of restoration projects in each catchment unit, and we are defining our catchment units as the 12-digit hydrological unit code. So each one of these is a different 𝗪12. And so we're using that to as our catchment units, and we're looking at the number of restoration projects within the catchment unit. And so for our dependent variables, overall, we're looking at the number of restoration project sites in each catchment unit, as I just said, but that can be broken down into different types of restoration projects. So you have riparian restoration project sites, in-stream, land, other, and other, just other types, because after we got to the three riparian, in-stream, and land, others are just everything else, and then total restoration projects are all together. And so we looked at multiple variables, and what I'm going to talk about mostly today is just to give you a background of what we looked at. I'm not going to really present results, but just kind of how we're thinking about it. So we looked at fish freshness. We looked at salmon evolutionary significant units, so ESUs within the catchment area, and the graphs on the left are just going to show where we have the data at. We looked at bull trout critical habitat, and we also looked at impaired water bodies. So these are our ecological and impaired variables that we are using in our model to look at the correlations. And then for our catchment variables, we looked at stream order, steepness. We also looked at the percentage of natural cover in the catchment, impervious cover, public land elevation. I don't have graphs for that in the interest of time, but we also looked at those. And then we get into our human and social characteristics. So these were the ones where we tried to look at commonly used environmental justice indicators to see if we could find some correlations. So we have population density, which is the population per square kilometer or kilometer, household income, and we used 2013 just because that fell within our range, because we're looking at data from 2015. And so we used a lot of census data that fell within that range. So from the last census count. Household with seniors is also another indicator that is used in environmental justice research, as well as households with children. And then we looked at education. And so we defined education as a percentage of the population over 25 with a college degree. And when we say college degree, we included all college degrees. So that goes from associate to PhD and includes professional degrees. We also looked at owner occupancy. So that is if the percentage of people who actually occupy the unit within the space. And then we looked at race and ethnicity, and we defined that as a percentage of non-white or non-Hispanic white individuals within that section, within the area. And so this is just a graph to kind of show what a few of those variables look like. So we have race, we have population density, and education. And then, And so what we're doing for our research is we are taking all of these variables and we are putting them into a negative binomial model to see if we can find correlations between the data. And so I'm not going to actually show the results because we're still figuring out what our model looks like and making sure we're accounting for zeros and where people are and where people aren't. But the idea is that we can pull all of these variables together to see which variables had some type of influence, or not necessarily had influence on the placement, because we can't say that people decided to put a project in this space here, but can be used as predictors to where restoration efforts have happened in the past. And so our next steps is to continue to fit our models, our account restoration work sites, and then to finalize them. And then we're hoping to repeat the process in other areas of the Pacific Northwest, so in other areas in Washington and also in the Willamette region, which is where I am currently located, and then try to find ways to compare across the different regions. And to just bring this back to the overall objective of this conference, our summit, is this idea that we want to incorporate social science principles and include diversity, equity, inclusion. And when we think about social science principles, I always think about people first, right? Like, I study people. And so this idea of how are we making sure the right people are included in the process, but also acknowledging that in some cases, some of the people who should have been included are some of the people who are directly being impacted by some of the decisions that are being made and aren't being included. And how can we think about ways to make that a part of the next steps moving forward? So understanding where restoration efforts tend to flow can potentially bring attention to potential environmental justice issues and inequities that are occurring in restoration projects. And then we can have, with that knowledge, we can move forward in a way in which we're making it more equitable, in the process more equitable, and making sure that people aren't getting, I guess, the short end of the stick. Are certain communities that traditionally have less access to restoration projects are being a part of the process. Are included. And so one of the things, I just, in interest of time, that we did find is a lot of the things that we, in our first run of the model, a lot of things that we kind of expected. So like certain types of habitats, certain types of ecological characteristics were correlated with the projects. And we were seeing that some of the social variables were falling in lines with other environmental justice research that has been done in the past. So we're really excited to get through our models and see what actually comes out of it. Hopefully we will be able to get that done soon and then compare it to other areas within the region and have some good results to present to people and maybe people on this call. And I think with that, I am at my 12 minutes. So I will do acknowledgements and then I will stop.
Thank you, Brittany. That was a great talk. And magically, we somehow built in an extra 5 minutes in the schedule this morning, right at your talk. So we're very good on time. And I encourage people to type questions in the Q&A. And Jenna's going to ask them. And as we're going through these, Bart, if you want to start sharing your screen whenever, that's great.
Awesome. There's a lot of questions here. So Ian asks, can you describe how you sampled the census data, presumably served in census blocks, into the HUC units that you used as your primary spatial unit of analysis?
Yeah, so we did take census data at the census block, and then some of our data we also took at the block group data. And then what we did was we then clipped it to the HUC 12 data, and for some of the we used the population weighted mean, because in some areas there weren't necessarily, like, the way the blocks were cut, to make sure that we had the actual number of people. Instead of just using the actual number, we weighted it by the population within the block group. I'm gonna say block for now, and maybe block group.
Okay, thanks. Okay, Jacqueline asks, well, obviously kudos, this is an amazing presentation, but did you also include Aboriginal or Indigenous in your analysis?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that we've talked about, and we've also gotten good feedback about it, is the way we're looking at race specifically. We're just comparing it as the percentage of white only. And so Indigenous are other communities all fall within that category of not being other white only. And we know that specifically because of this region, it may make more sense to look at different racial categories and break them down, because there may be specific inequity concerns that deal with certain groups. So we haven't looked at it yet, but it is something that we have talked about in our next steps, I guess I would say.
Okay. And then we have a two-part question from Laura. Do you have a plan to return to the Puget Sound and present upon a completion? I'll let you answer that one first.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we're any presentations we can get, we'll take them. I think hopefully we will have something. The plan is to have something, our results in the next couple of months. So we're excited to have something to present to people.
Great. Okay. And the second part of that question is also, how does the database of restoration projects you chose to use compare with the projects in the State Recreation and Conservation Office database, which is PRISM?
Can you repeat that question? I didn't miss it.
Also, how does the database of restoration projects you chose to use compare with the projects in the State Recreation and Conservation Office database, which is PRISM?
I am not sure of the answer to that question. I can look into that, but I'm not sure how they compare to PRISM.
Okay. And then it looks like we have a couple questions in the chat. I'm hopefully getting these in order. From Jason. Work in the 𝗲𝗏𝗰 River corridor has leveraged DOE dollars for restoration for green job training and rain garden and salmon habitat construction. Do you know of other examples of where restoration funding has doubled to address other issues in the 𝗵𝗵𝗁𝗂𝗃 communities?
So I don't know the answer to that part, but I do know one of the other things that we are looking at in our project, and I didn't mention it too much, is because we're still working through the nuts and bolts of it. So we're looking at where the restoration projects are, but also the amount of money spent on restoration within each areas. And then that results in us looking at the sources of where that money is coming from and why it is being used for restoration in those projects. So I think as we dive more into the actual cost of the projects and where they're placed, I think we will be able to see if there are specific projects that are funded for specific issues. That probably will come more out of the cost side of it than the actual just the count side.
Okay. Jason, can we do this one last question? Is that we got time?
Yep.
Okay. Ian asks, are census data the best we have in terms of telling us something useful about people that live on the landscape?
That's a good question. I don't know if I would necessarily say it's the worst. I don't know if I would say it's the best. I think it does give you a count, and it is very the questions are pretty simple. So it's just like, it says like, oh, this is your race, or this is this and this is that, and it doesn't dive into specific issues of it related to the community. And so I think it's a good starting point, but I also think that because a lot of times these issues aren't thought about, it's a good starting point. But the more we start to incorporate diversity and equity and look at social inequalities, it may make more sense to focus more specifically on surveying people around the issues instead of just using a large survey like the census to say this is what this person is or this is what this community is made up. Actually going and talking to the communities about how they're experiencing the environment, I think that's probably more valuable.
Great. Thanks so much, Brittany. I'm glad we somehow gave you an extra 5 minutes. That was really great to have that many questions. And people listening in, if you have further questions, put them in Q&A, and just remember to tag the speaker's name with that question would be great. So you've been looking at Bart's title slide for a while now. So without further ado, Bart, take it away.
All right, I will. So first, my apologies. I do not have a webcam on this computer, so you will not see me, only my slides. So I work at the Nearshore Habitat Program at the Washington Department of Natural Resources. And today I'll be talking about potential impacts of shoreline armor on intertidal eelgrass in central Puget Sound. So, let's see, there we go. So I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but why do we care about eelgrass and seagrass in general? Well, you know, I think this picture really illustrates the importance of eelgrass beds. So these are very productive habitats that provide food and shelter for a wide variety of organisms, ranging from really small inverts to endangered and commercially important fish species and even waterfowl. Now, eelgrass is often used as an indicator for the health of coastal ecosystems, also in Puget Sound. And the reason why is that it's sensitive to human impacts. So it's sensitive to a wide range of stressors, and one of the potential stressors is the presence of shoreline armor. So we do know that in Puget Sound, shoreline armor can have several effects on beach habitats, like steepening of shoreline, reductions in beach width, impact on riparian vegetation, and so on. And these effects are usually most pronounced the closer you are to the armor. So it's a lot harder to detect them at lower tidal elevations, further away from the armor. And that is exactly where eelgrass grows. So, how can shoreline armor then impact eelgrass? Well, the general thinking is that in Puget Sound, bluff erosion is an important source of sediments for beaches. And if you have a large fraction of the shoreline that is armored, reduced inputs of sediments can eventually impact eelgrass by changing the substrate, even in lower intertidal. Now, if this is the case, potential effects would probably be easiest to detect in the central basin of Puget Sound, because that's a region where a high percentage of the shorelines is armored and where shoreline armor has been in place for long periods of time. So far, this has been mostly conceptual. There's only a few studies that have directly looked at potential impact of shoreline armor on eelgrass in our region. So today I'd like to present some initial results from an analysis where we've linked data from DNR's eelgrass monitoring program to a number of other data sets to see if we can detect the potential impact of shoreline armor on eelgrass in the intertidal. And the area that we'll focus on is the central basin of Puget Sound. So between 2014 and 2020, we did a number of collaborations with tribes and local governments to do a detailed survey of eelgrass in this area. And this project was actually initiated by the Suquamish tribe back in 2014. And since then, we've done additional collaborations with the city of Bainbridge Island, King County, and Snohomish County. And we also had a funded NTA to expand the footprint of this project to 𝗂𝗏𝗂𝗧 Passage. So the map on the left shows, let me get the laser pointer, shows basically the locations. Each dot here is a site that we have sampled, and each of these sites represents a section of 1,000 meters of shoreline. And each of these sites has been sampled with, on average, 10 transects. And you can see, an example of what that looks like over here. So these transects are oriented perpendicular to shore, and they're sampled using towed underwater videography. So in total, we've sampled 378 sites with over 3,800 transects. That's one transect, give or take, every 100 meters for most of the shoreline of the central basin of Puget Sound. So a lot of data. And here is one of the high-level results of this project. So this map on the right over here shows eelgrass area per site. So darker colors and larger symbols indicate larger eelgrass beds. So we estimate that there is approximately 1,300 hectares of eelgrass in the study area, and give or take 37% of all that eelgrass grows in the intertidal. And we define that as shallower than the extreme low tide line. So this would, give us an estimate of almost 480 hectares of intertidal eelgrass in the study area that could potentially be impacted by shoreline armoring. So we did two analyses to look at potential effects of shoreline armor on eelgrass. So for a first analysis, we're looking basically at the level of the drift cell. And we combined our eelgrass data with results from the ESRP Beach Strategies project, so the geodatabase. And what we did is we calculated for each drift cell the fraction of transects with intertidal eelgrass, as well as the average depth of the shallow edge of eelgrass beds per drift cell. And then we compared that to the fraction of shoreline armored, the mean slope of the intertidal, the mean fetch, so the mean exposure of the beach, and the mean tidal range per drift cell. So, and to put this all together, we used a principal component analysis. So on this plot over here, the arrows represents the explanatory variables. So fetch, mean tide, mean slope, and fraction armor total. And what you can see is that mean fetch, mean slope, and mean tidal range, these have the highest loadings on the first principal component. And the fraction of shoreline armor has the highest loading on the second principal component. Now, each of these dots represents a drift cell. And I colored them based on the fraction of transects with Zostra marina. So basically, how often is intertidal eelgrass found in these drift cells? So if you have a red color over here, almost no transects had eelgrass. If you have dark green colors, almost all the transects had eelgrass. And if you look at this plot, you can see that there is a pattern in the data. So the occurrence of eelgrass is significantly correlated with principal component 1. And that basically suggests that intertidal eelgrass is most commonly found in drift cells with a long fetch, a gentle slope, and a lower tidal range. And if you would do this analysis for the shallow edge of eelgrass beds, you'd see the same pattern. Now, this kind of fits into our conceptual understanding of what limits eelgrass, the upper edge of eelgrass beds. So in the central basin of Puget Sound, eelgrass is probably limited at the upper edge by desiccation at low tides. So basically, how you could interpret this is that, if you have sites with gentle slopes that are more exposed, there can probably be more washover of water at low tides or more pooling of water, and that could protect the plants from desiccation and allow them to grow higher up in the intertidal. Now, we did not see a strong effect of shoreline armor at this spatial scale. And in retrospect, that kind of makes sense because we're dealing with a lot of variability here. There's high natural variability in the measured parameters, and that makes it really difficult to detect potential effects of shoreline armor at this broad spatial scale. So for a second analysis, we used a more targeted approach to try to remove some of that noise. And we compared our data set with 65 pairs of beaches from the 𝗕𝗏 2016. So these pairs of beaches are similar in terms of geomorphology, but one of the beaches is always armored while the other is not. So out of these 65 pairs, which are shown on the map over here, there's 31 pairs of sites where we had an SVMP transect, an eelgrass transect within a distance of 50 meters measured along the shoreline. And of these, there were 23 pairs of sites where both of these transects had eelgrass in the intertidal. And the location is broadly denoted by these red circles over here. So we had 14 pairs in the central region and 9 pairs in the north region. Now, at these 23 pairs of beaches, we compared the depth of the shallow edge of eelgrass beds between armored and unarmored sites using a paired t-test. And when you look at the entire data set, there's a significant difference in the depth of the shallow edge. So on average, eelgrass grew 0.8 feet higher at sites without shoreline armor. And this effect was actually more pronounced in the central basin. So if you only look at those 14 sites, there's an average difference of 1.3 feet. Now, when you look at the north region, there's no significant difference. So, why not in the north region? Well, this could either be due to the low sample size, where we're dealing here with 9 pairs of sites, but it could also be a regional difference in either shoreline armor or geomorphology.
2 minutes, Bart.
Okay, so what can we take away from all this? Well, this is a preliminary analysis. So it does suggest, though, that shoreline armor can have an effect on the shallow edge of eelgrass beds, but it's a subtle effect. And we only detected this by doing a paired analysis that removed some of the natural variability and other parameters. But as if this happens throughout central Puget Sound, it may be important. Now, with that, I kind of want to put out some caveats. So we do think there are other stressors than shoreline armor that may be more damaging to eelgrass beds. So during this project, we've detected several places where there were large accumulations of green macroalgae. And one example is Yukon Harbor on this map on the left here. So here we found over 65 hectares covered by a thick layer of green algae spread over 7 sites. And the majority of this algae was in the subtidal. So if you stand on the beach, you couldn't even see it. So this would suggest that there are local impacts of eutrophication in the central basin of Puget Sound. And this could be more damaging to eelgrass than, for example, shoreline armor. And then finally, if you look at the DNR eelgrass data as a whole, we usually see that there have been declines in enclosed embayments or at sites with reduced flushing. So at these sites, restoring flushing could be really beneficial for eelgrass beds. And one of the restoration projects that we are excited about is that recent removal of the causeway at SR 116 near 𝗕𝗃 Harbor. So we're really looking forward to what the impacts on eelgrass will be in 𝗕𝗃 Harbor. And with that, I'd like to acknowledge all our partners, particularly 𝗂𝗃𝗵𝗁 tribe, City of Bainbridge Island, King County, Snohomish County. I do want to mention that part of this work was funded by an NTA, and I really want to thank our techs who have watched way too much video, as well as Ian Fraser from Marine Research Consultants for countless hours of fieldwork. And with that, I'll take questions.
Great, thanks so much, Bart. Great talk, and really cool to see you linking those different data sets together. Okay, Jenna, what do we have for questions?
We've got a couple questions here. So one from Ian: the significant difference in the elevation of the upper edge at armored sites is interesting, but I think I missed how you measured the elevation of the upper edge. Can all or part of that difference be explained by uncertainty in that measurement?
See, that's definitely a factor. And some of that variability could be explained by that. So the way we measure our depth, so when we take these transects every second, we look at the video frame. Now, while our camera is running on the towfish on the boat, we have a biosonics echo sounder that pulses, and through which we get canopy corrected estimates of eelgrass depth. And then we do afterwards a correction for the tide to get an estimate of how deep that video frame was. So we have a value every second, and we can use that to calculate the slope, and we can use that to get an estimate of eelgrass. There's definitely some uncertainty around these estimates, I'm not gonna lie, but the thing is that if you see this consistent pattern between armored and unarmored, despite this variability in our measurement, I do think that the pattern is real. So there is no bias between armored and unarmored sites in our depth measurements. There's just a lot of noise.
Mm-hmm. And we have another question from George. It says, have you looked at the relationship of armoring and eelgrass based on relative encroachment of the armor?
Not yet, and that is kind of one of the next steps. So I do want to mention that this is a first step at this. This is a preliminary analysis because Tish really challenged us to look at this, and we hadn't done that before. So these are first steps, and what you just said is definitely one of the next steps.
Okay. That's all for the questions that I see, unless you see anything, Jason.
That's
great.
Comments. We should move on anyway, but again, put more in Q&A if you want, and just tag Bart's name with that would be awesome. And Brian McTeague, if you want to start sharing your screen, we can get you fired up. And while Brian's doing that, Amy Kinney, you are on deck after Brian.
Great. Good morning, folks. Let me see if I can share my PowerPoint here. All right. And you guys are just seeing the full slide, correct? None of my verbiage on the side.
We are still seeing your desktop, actually.
Okay. Let me see if I can properly share. Try that again. All right. I think that would be. All right. Is that the full slide or the desktop still?
You're all good. Take it away.
Sweet. Thanks, Jason. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks to Tish, Jay, Jason, Jenna, the other co-hosts, everyone else who's helped pull off the Nearshore Summit. Beautiful day here in the South Sound, and strange days with COVID, but really amazing you guys have pulled this off all on the Zoom. Thanks also to all the folks who, through their passion for the health and beauty of the Salish Sea, all of our hard work, and the folks that have provided all the data that we've assembled as part of our coastal catchment analysis project. This is a landscape-based strategy for nearshore assessment in the line of the 𝗃𝗏 project, which everyone I think is familiar with from back in 2010. Just a couple quick introductions. I'm 𝗵𝗵𝗁, the natural resources GIS guy at the 𝗂𝗏𝑐𝑒 Island tribe down here in 𝗕𝗃𝗁𝗁 in the South Salish Sea. Scott Steltzner, who is the brains behind this project, is our research scientist and kind of drives our restoration and conservation activities. 𝗂𝗶𝗴𝘁 helped us with the report writing and a lot of the data management and Excel crunching behind the project. 𝗵𝗵𝗁𝗁 was my predecessor at 𝗂𝗏𝑐𝑒 back in the day, and he did a pilot project down here in Butt Inlet that kind of informed this larger project. Joshua Whitener is our GIS manager at the tribe. This is a picture here of 𝗂𝗏𝑐𝑒 Island behind our names, and you'll see 𝗪𝗏𝑇ℛ Island off to the right, Hope Island's over here to the left. The reservation and 𝗵𝗏𝗁𝗁 is down around the corner here, down towards Little Skookum Inlet. All right, so what and why? Well, the why is, I think we're all pretty aware of the continuing decline of important species here in the South Sound or in the entire Salish Sea, including salmon, orca, and other indicator species. The loss of their habitats as we have more conversion and more folks moving here. And the key to this all is the ecological functions upon which this wildlife depends. This stuff is also not just science for the 𝗂𝗏𝑐𝑒 Island tribe, but these resources are also part of the livelihood and the culture of 𝗂𝗏𝑐𝑒 Island tribal members, as well as the tribal members of the rest of the Salish Sea tribes, and of course ourselves as well. We all depend on healthy ecosystems to survive. And the idea was to provide a bridge of all this cool data and help inform projects and policies and where are we going to do this stuff on the landscape. As I mentioned, there was 𝗃𝗏, and there have been a lot of other prioritization projects that our project was informed by. And I guess we kind of stand on the shoulders of some of that stuff. The scale of those projects, especially the 𝗃𝗏, was too broad to really be as helpful as we would hope as we place projects that are oftentimes very small in number of, small number of acres. So to actually place those projects using science and best available knowledge, we needed a tool that was a little bit more zoomed in, if you will. I should also note that tribes are pretty unique. I've worked with the 𝗂𝗏𝑐𝑒 Island tribe for about 10 years. And tribes are local in that folks and the tribal members reside within the counties and the towns and the inlets of the South Sound. But tribes are also regional when we consider ceded lands, usual and accustomed areas, and the broad landscape scale of where traditional uses occurred. We also collaborate with a lot of other tribes and also the Northwest Indian Fishery Commission. We have a Northwest Tribal GIS user group, and those are great resources that we're able to interact with and ask questions and get a little bit smarter along the way. So of course, I guess I touched on this already. How do we provide the science to inform projects, and where can we get the greatest benefit and the best return on ecological functions that are going to help these species that need these habitats to survive? And again, the 𝗃𝗏 stuff, I think I could probably have left these all blank, and we probably could have filled them in along the way. But I think 𝗃𝗏 did a great job of providing some of these overview and large or high level perspectives on what it's going to take to make some progress on the ground. It's all about science, right? But then it's the people and the projects that actually benefit the habitats and the species. So very similar, our project used these same kind of goals and purposes, focuses on the natural processes, the functions that provide habitat. And then the idea is, where do we protect and where do we restore? Again, I'm sure we're all familiar with this stuff, and everyone's seen this one as well. These different process units, very similar throughout the Sound. And then again, trying to determine on a unit by unit scale, Where do we protect? Where do we restore? Our project kind of lumped protection and conservation in as one, and restoration and enhancement as one as well. And we all are pretty familiar with this one. This is a Nearshore Summit. Why is the marine nearshore so important? Well, we know it's a kind of the bridge between the marine and the terrestrial areas. Many of the critters rely on the nearshore habitat for part or most or all of their life history. Also provides resiliency to sea level changes, which is really an important one that I know a lot of folks at NOAA, USGS, and University of Washington have been doing some great work on. And that's stuff that's informing some of our projects too. I know some of our projects are starting to incorporate, okay, well, what happens if the sea level goes up 3 feet? We want our project to succeed over time for decades and even 100 years. So let's start considering sea level rise. And of course, the wheel of fortune for Puget Sound restoration. This one's, I know it's probably on everyone's wall as we try to justify grant proposals and obtain funding for projects. It can be hard to make this work when we're actually trying to maybe fit a square project through these pie piece holes, but it's definitely can help inform us and keep us in, help us remember what we're trying to accomplish and for whom or for what. So this here is a screenshot of the Coastal Catchment Analysis Project. This is actually a project that was begun in just after 𝗔𝗃, and then the first rollout of this was in 2015. We've been updating it over the last year or so, incorporating the newest data, a lot of it from the folks up at Coastal Geologic Services, the beach strategies. Thank you very much to Andrea and Jim and others up there. Really good stuff. The great thing about the new data is we have a kind of a finer resolution, right? We're getting data that really brings us into this larger scale or smaller area that, again, is where projects occur. The importance of the CCAP approach was using these SHEAP catchments, which are very small catchments on the average of about 19 acres. So that really delineates the shoreline into finer segments, which allows when you run a bunch of intersects like armoring or forage fish or eelgrass, other types of habitat, where might a project succeed based on these beneficial attributes like eelgrass or limiting attributes like armoring. And of course, you can ask these questions, hey, where should we remove armor to benefit forage fish, or where will we have a likelihood of success for this type of project? Through the map viewer, which I'm happy to share the link, or if you just do a search for coastal catchment analysis, you can pull this guy up and play around with it. I haven't updated the data yet, but I plan on doing that in the next month or so. You can view all the other projects that have occurred, and these are the Washington Recreation and Conservation Office projects, and useful to know where other projects have occurred as you're considering additional projects, because oftentimes these complement each other, and you get a couple projects together, sometimes the sum is greater than the parts. We work with the Salmon Enhancement Group, Capital Land Trust, conservation districts. We're involved with the tags and other groups here in the South Sound to bring projects to fruition. And oftentimes, usually it's a group effort. So here's an example of the 𝗔𝗃 on the left. You can see this is the strategy beach. Those units of analysis are kind of large. I mean, sure, it'd be nice if we could restore or enhance the entire west shore of Butt Inlet, but we would think for our use, these smaller catchment analysis units of the CCAP allow us to really focus in, and like our partners, the Capital Land Trust or Salmon Enhancement Group, will take a look at the map or give me a call and we'll run through stuff. And well, was a project here a good fit? Another example of that showing, this is in Henderson Inlet down here. Large, this entire area, maybe can't protect all that. That's a lot of money, right? Well, we can zoom in here and get a little bit finer detail and see where other projects have occurred and maybe focus in on an area that might be good for preservation. And again, see other projects that have occurred there too.
Brian, you're at 2 minutes.
Thank you, Jason. Just a listing of all the beneficial and limiting attributes. a lot of data sources come into this analysis that we ran, and those are all just a series of intersects and then calculation of percentages and whatnot when it comes to shoreline armoring or forage fish. And because I'm not going to dive too deeply into how we used some of the symbolization. We made this a regional. There's 7 inlets in the South Sound. So we treated Butt Inlet, which is a very developed inlet, a little different than Totten Inlet, which is less developed. But each inlet is ranked within that inlet. Another thing we did was we looked at not just our individual catchments, but the neighborhood in which that catchment resides. So even if a catchment is perhaps fairly developed, if the catchments around it are less developed, then you may have a greater success of restoring a catchment that's pretty hammered, but looks pretty good as a neighborhood. And we can also look at the coastal catchments here and say, is the development closer to the shoreline, the 200 meters immediately adjacent to the shoreline, or is it more upland? We're going to skip over this one, just talking about, well, do we also see salmon in wetlands? It's a way to further inform projects. Again, many partners, many data sources. I'll shout out to all of you, but you'll probably be getting a call from me to request that update on data. Thanks much. We've noticed that the map app has not been used as much for informing projects or where to put them, but when opportunity arises, as often happens, then folks will ask me to, hey, how would a project work in here? So we're going to look to enhance and allow the ability for folks to add their own data to the web map so they can see, hey, where are my projects? Or pull in, as a lot of folks probably are doing now, pulling in other data from ArcGIS Online so you can view additional data on top of it. So as they say around the Squaxin Island tribal area, we raise our hands. I'd like to raise my hands to all of you that have done so much great work to inform the data of our project. And we keep in mind that there are 7 generations before us, and there will be 7 generations after. And let's keep that in mind as we plan these projects on the landscape. Please feel free to be in touch. Any questions, concerns? I really enjoy taking phone calls and talking about this stuff. And I really appreciate everyone who takes my phone calls when I have questions about your data or your project. And thanks again for an opportunity to present. This has been a great forum, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the presentations. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Brian. Yeah, communication is good. So let's take a question. And while we're doing that, Amy, if you want to start sharing your screen, please.
Yep. We've got one from Atoll. I think I got that right. Is catchment the same thing as basin?
Yes. A catchment is just a small basin. These all people are familiar with the 𝗪𝗁. These are coastal catchments were derived by the Northwest Indian Fishery Commission's 𝗪𝗏 program using ArcHydro. So the catchments nest within the 𝗪𝗁, nest within the larger watersheds. And that was intentional. We wanted to make sure that our analysis would, nest within the other analysis that have been done so folks can kind of zoom in. I mean, the idea might be, hey, here's a great Pisner place for a project. How does the CCAP run that one? Or we have other data. Brittany was just speaking to the analysis they've done using 𝗪𝗁. So using a similar unit of analysis is key. And also why we use the DNR shoreline as well for all of our nearshore linear data sets.
Awesome. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Jenna.
Great. Thanks so much, Brian. And any further questions, please type them in the Q&A. So we have 2 speakers left until break. Let's keep the information coming. Amy, take it away.
Hi. So can you see my screen and hear me, Jason? All right. Excellent. So I'm going to build on Jim's presentation from this morning and Lisa's presentation yesterday in talking about sea level rise. And for the summit here, I've been put in the social scientist bin. So I'm going to talk about how we respond to some of the challenges they identified using social approaches. So we know communities are going to face more coastal flooding, increased bluff retreat, but we also know that beaches are going to face coastal squeeze, where armored beachers won't be able to shift landward as sea level rises. And so the science tells us that sea level rise is really going to exacerbate some of the adverse impacts of armor that we're already experiencing. Like Jim's presentation showed, a lot of the efforts to adapt for sea level rise are really focused on impacts and projects on public property and infrastructure. And rightfully so, that's going to be a huge challenge. But we also need to prepare for impacts on private property and how homeowners are going to respond to these new threats. This is particularly important in the Puget Sound region because most of Puget Sound's shoreline is residential property. 57% of the length is single family residential, and we've got 45,000 plus individual parcels along Puget Sound. This is the reason ESRP invested in Shore Friendly in the first place, to reverse what Hugh talked about yesterday, this legacy of cumulative impacts of widespread armoring, as well as those future threats. We really need to deal with the residential parcels. Absent strict enforceable regulations mandating retrofitting of existing homes or major changes in homeowner insurance requirements, coastal resilience in a changing climate will largely reflect private voluntary decisions of individuals. So let's sit with that for a second. What the future of Puget Sound beaches is going to depend on private voluntary decisions. If we want homeowners to choose and implement shore-friendly options for sea level rise adaptation, we would need to help them. So what do I mean by lowercase shore-friendly options for sea level rise adaptation? I'm talking about armor removal. I'm talking about elevating homes to reduce coastal flooding risk. And I'm talking about moving homes landward, inland from eroding bluffs. So this region is really fortunate to have a strong local network of uppercase shore-friendly programs that are ready and able to influence those private voluntary decisions. As we heard yesterday, and will again later today, I know Christina's following me, they're already doing really amazing work, but they need additional tools at their disposal if they're going to address sea level rise. When Shore Friendly was being developed 8 years ago, they made a deliberate decision to avoid addressing climate change because they didn't think landowners were ready for it. Since then, there have been some notable extreme high water level events and landslides. And all indications are that homeowners are ready to talk about sea level rise now. So my call for action today is that it's time to expand the Shore Friendly toolbox to address climate change adaptation. We just finished a study that assessed the feasibility of one tool that could be added to the Shore Friendly toolbox, a new loan program that would help homeowners finance armor removal as well as elevation and relocation projects. The final report is going to be posted on the Encyclopedia of Puget Sound and the Habitat Strategic Initiative web pages very soon. And today I'm going to talk about just one element of this study. That's our market analysis. And this work was a collaboration with Coastal Geologic Services. I want to shout out particularly to Lauren and Avery, who helped with this, as well as Andrea McLennan, who helped scope our methods. So our market analysis had two research questions. First, how big is the market for elevating homes and relocating away from retreating bluffs? And by market, I mean the number of parcels vulnerable to flooding and landslide hazards. And then the second question was, is there homeowner demand for these types of projects and loans to help pay for them? Here we wanted to know, are the homeowners ready to take these sort of actions? So to calculate market size, Coastal Geologic Services used shore type as a proxy for hazard vulnerability. And we did this because, ideally you would start with the number of parcels of certain shore types, and you'd get more parcel specific information about flooding risk, landslide risk, and if there's space to move the home inland. But we were really lacking that parcel level data on flooding risk, as well as the bluff retreat risk. And this is something we're looking forward to see the project Jim mentioned earlier that he's working on with Ian Miller, that will get a little more parcel level data about those hazards. And this is really important moving forward, because you need that data incorporated into local planning documents to be able to access some emergency management funding for hazard mitigation. So in the future, it will be really important to have these things nailed down to open up funding. We were able to sort of get at space to move home inland based on some data we used for our demand analysis. So what we did for our demand analysis is we took that market size data, so using shore type as a proxy for hazard, and we used homeowner surveys and focus group findings from when Shore Friendly was first developed to reduce that number by % that are interested in those projects. So then we got a number of projects. And then further, we reduced it by the percentage that indicated they were interested in loans. And so we came up with demand for loans. So you can see our results. We went down from about 22,000 parcels down to, we think there's demand for about 400 elevation relocation projects and 65 loans. There was some, we've recognized some uncertainty in these numbers. We think the market size is a little high because we weren't able to reduce that shore type data for parcel level hazards. We think the % interested in projects may be low because this elevation or this survey data is old. It's from 2014. And like I said, all indication from the folks that are on the ground with landowners indicate that there's more interest and it's growing every day. We also think the loan numbers are a little bit low. The focus group asked about loans for armor removal in soft shore projects. And home elevation or relocation projects are going to be a lot more expensive. So we think it's likely that if someone was moving forward with those, they would be interested, more interested in loans. And so, those numbers are pretty low compared to the full market size. So expanding that demand really should be a near-term priority. And so shore-friendly programs are really going to be a key for that, and adding new tools will be very important. One of the first steps is really to understand barriers to and motivators for those preferred behaviors we talked about, the armor removal, elevation, and relocating homes. And Lisa mentioned this yesterday, but a new updated homeowner survey is a really high priority research need. And then we want to design and deploy incentives that address those specific barriers and motivators. This social marketing approach has worked really well so far for Shore Friendly. We want to develop audience tested messages to correct misperceptions about walls. A lot of people, when you read the comments from those surveys, they think a larger seawall is going to protect them from flooding. And in most cases, that is definitely not true. We want to provide technical assistance. This is an element that the local shore-friendly programs really shine. They provide both technical guidance, site-specific erosion assessments, help securing contractors, help designing projects, help permitting projects. But also there's a lot of soft skills involved in this too. They talk about oftentimes a lot of hand-holding is needed with homeowners to get projects through the process. And I would imagine that, if a project is jacking up your house, you're probably going to need a little more emotional support than when they're working at your beach. And the good news, there's a large body of emergency management literature about the psychology behind those decisions and what support homeowners will need.
You're at 1 minute, Amy.
Okay, thanks. Finally, money is going to be really important. We know this from, again, the existing 6-7 years of shore-friendly projects. And then finally, I want you to think back to that initial quote slide. Regulations and insurance reform are really important as well. I focused on incentives, but this isn't an either or situation. The challenges we're facing are really large, and we need all the policy levers we can get. And I think Sydney's going to talk about regulations in just a little bit. So again, my key message, conserving Puget Sound beaches in a changing climate will require helping waterfront homeowners choose and implement shore-friendly options to address sea level rise impacts. To wrap up, I just want to thank our study funders, Habitat Strategic Initiative. They're going to be hosting a webinar on March 31st about the feasibility study, which has a lot more than this market analysis, and we'll have time to dig into it then. Thanks for listening, and thanks to the program chair for a great summit.
Great, thanks so much, Amy, great talk. Let's get some questions for Amy, and while we're doing that, Christina, if you want to start sharing your screen.
All right, Tina asks, are those images of homes being moved from this region? So I think that was early in your presentation.
Yep, so I know the 2 townhouses being moved back from the bluff was Island County. And I'm not sure, I know in my report I have an elevation project that I believe was also Island County, but I'm not sure about that first picture.
And Hugo asks, sea level rise will change the ordinary high water used to delineate private from public lands in some instances. Have you considered what would the implications of this be in the context of waterfront land ownership?
So I have not. I know there is there's work in other parts of the country because there is potential when an owner doesn't own the tidelands that they could be losing property as sea level rises, but I'm not an attorney, so I can't speak much more than that.
Okay. Let's see. Jennifer Griffiths put the information for your webinar in the chat with the links to that.
Thanks, Jennifer.
And Lisa asks, how are you addressing the messy is beautiful concept from yesterday's presentation by Karen? How do you get at changing the shoreline community paradigm thought that manicured lawns are the proper image or not the proper image?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's a great challenge. And I think the shore-friendly model where it's one-on-one engagement with landowners. So you're able to talk to them about their concerns, hear their concerns, and talk through it. And I know I've read some, Karen's closeout reports for her grants, and she talks about approaching it approaching it with gardening and talking about gardening and aesthetics and design can really help put those landowners at ease. And so again, you need that one-on-one engagement with people with the technical skills as well as those soft skills.
Mm-hmm. Okay, are we out of time, Jason?
Why don't I do one more quick one? Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. Kurt asks, how are you addressing the arguments from others that push shoreline armoring? Contractors that build these structures will continue to argue against your approaches.
So that is part of the overall shoreline armoring implementation strategy is there's a training strategy where they're working directly with contractors to teach them about some of these other tools. And I know there's one contractor, I think for Kitsap County, that sees the business opportunity in this sort of work. And I think he jokes, Christina can maybe correct me on this, I think he jokes that the first half of his career was putting in armoring and the second half is going to be taking out armoring.
Great, thanks so much, Amy. And a good segue to Christina. So without further ado, our last talk before break. Take it away, Christina.
Good morning, everyone. Can you see my screen and me?
Yep, all good.
Okay, wonderful. So hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. I work for Kitsap County in the Department of Community Development, and I get to lead the shore-friendly program in Kitsap, and I get to do all the fun work working with waterfront landowners and helping them, guiding them along in their journeys to their, developing their bulkhead removal projects. So in my talk today, I'll be taking a retrospective look back over the last 6 years at shore-friendly projects done in Kitsap to see how they compare to prioritized restoration opportunities that we have identified by our local nearshore tool. So can this comparison kind of tell us how shore-friendly is doing, give us any insight into how our program is making headway with nearshore recovery? Oops, okay. Uh-oh, how do I advance my slide? Oh, there we go. Okay, so I'll start off here with giving you a picture of Indianola Spit, which is on the Kitsap Peninsula. This photo was taken in 1952, and you can see it's a classic barrier beach embayment. Behind is Miller Bay with the long, it's got such a long, beautiful spit. And at this point in time, it's pretty much untouched, and it's stunning. Here's the same spot in 2006 and in 2016, and you can see how much the spit has widened. I mean, the land has actually grown in width. It's covered with houses and docks. The road runs up and down it, and the shore form is pretty much transformed. So as we've been talking about, and as you guys all know, hardened shorelines are a continual problem for the health of nearshore ecosystems. And as much as I'd love to just turn the clock back or simply, rip out all those bulkheads, the answer just isn't that simple. And naturalizing beaches and restoring processes is a challenge in an urban environment where there's so many constraints. Kitsap County has about 7,800 private waterfront parcels, and over half of them have some kind of hard armor structure on them. The shore-friendly program is proving to be a hopeful way to get at this challenge. We provide a range of incentives to motivate people to remove those bulkheads or replace them with some kind of soft shore protection. The program's built on social marketing concepts, and we tap into people's motivations to shift norms and behaviors. And the program's approach is voluntary, and we cast our net pretty wide when it comes to marketing and outreach. And when the shore-friendly program began as a pilot, we knew we had a big opportunity to make an impact with the 201 miles of residential shoreline. And a lot of this shoreline was in lower energy, kind of lower risk reaches. And for that reason, we took an ad hoc approach in how we select projects, and we didn't target specific landowners. Also, when our pilot began, we didn't have a quantitative way to evaluate projects. But 2 years later, in 2017, the county did some nearshore prioritization work that was led by Paul Schlinger and CGS, and we synthesized available studies and assessments to come up with a comprehensive interpretation of priority restoration and protection opportunities. And this nearshore tool is salmon-centric, and it evaluates projects with respect to its benefits to juvenile Chinook salmon. And as we onboarded the tool, we thought, we would use this as a filter to filter those shore-friendly projects to maximize restoration dollars and help get the higher priority projects done. But how things shook out was we never really had the demand of projects to kind of warrant this filtering. So before I get into the projects comparison, I'd like to give you some context about the tool, but hopefully not get too deep into the weeds about it. So the main highlight of the tool is that it's formula-based, and you can rank and score any project in real time on a parcel level scale. The formula is quite complex, and it incorporates a number of different terms. A big one is the affected process of the project. So we're talking about the processes of sediment transport, sediment source, cross-shore connectivity, tidal flow, and fish passage. It also incorporates integrated priority drift cells and reaches. suitability concept, so the right project for the right place, structure and function, mostly how it relates to habitat. So there's components of eelgrass, forage fish spawning areas, and riparian cover in the formula, and then project size. So the original prioritization identified about 333 restoration projects, and of this set, 237 were potential armor removals, and they addressed the process types of sediment source, sediment transport, and cross-shore connectivities, or combinations of those. So all the potential opportunities were then scored by the tool and ranked in order, and then they were binned in 4 tiers, with tier 1 being the highest priority. And when you look at the distribution of scores, you can see that the armor removal opportunities tended to fall into those lower priority tier 3 and 4 categories. And this has a lot to do with the weighting of the formula. So specifically, tidal flow and fish passage type projects are weighted with higher salmon benefits than the other processes. So now getting to the comparison. So over the last 6 years, there were 11 shore-friendly projects that were done on Kitsap's eastern shores. And of the 11, 5 were originally identified by the Nearshore tool, and you can see those shown by the yellow dots. And then there were 6 projects that were not identified by the tool, and those are shown in red. And now in this map, we're looking at all of the 11 projects together, regardless if they were originally identified by the tool or not. So when the projects were scored, 10 projects came out as tier 4, and 1 project came out as a tier 3. And this isn't too surprising that these scores are mostly lower priority in the tier 4, because just given the distribution of those armor removal projects and how they tend to fall into the lower tiers. So now I'd like to take a project example, a closer look here. This is a project that we did in Dyes Inlet, and you can see the before and after pictures there on the left. The project spanned 2 parcels and removed about 220 linear feet of concrete bulkhead. And at that size, it ranks as a tier 4 when you just score those 2 parcels. However, the Nearshore tool actually identified it as a larger project complex comprised of 11 parcels, and at that size, it scores as a tier 3. So, in theory, there was opportunity, or if to increase the size, and if we'd been able to do that, then this would have resulted in a higher priority project. So this seems to present a missed opportunity. This was actually the case for 5 projects that were originally identified by the tool that turned out to be shore-friendly projects. In theory, they could have been larger projects with multiple parcels, as the prioritization tool showed. Increasing the size would obviously increase the ecological benefits. And I do want to say that when we're out in the field working with landowners and an interested homeowner who's doing a shore-friendly project, we do make an effort to reach out to the neighbors to see if there's greater interest along the beach. But I think the question is, how do we do this with more of a concerted effort, with more finesse, and potentially use social marketing tools to our advantage here to capture bigger projects? Okay, so this reflection also shows us that there's more potential opportunity to do higher priority armor removal projects than we're currently capitalizing on. So the pie chart shows the potential opportunity for armor removal projects according to the Nearshore Tools database. And you can see that those higher priority projects in tiers 1 and 2 do represent about 30% of potential projects available, according to the tool. So that's, really not a piece of the pie that Shore Friendly is currently capturing. We're mostly getting these tier 4 projects using our ad hoc approach in project selection. So another takeaway is that there's more opportunity on the ground than the Nearshore tool originally identified. There were 6 shore-friendly projects that were not part of this original Nearshore tools database. And this is, also again, somewhat expected because the original database of opportunities wasn't exhaustive and we had limited resources to do that fine scale work of compiling potential projects. Also, these 6 projects, that were not identified by the tool were mostly ones that addressed the process of cross-shore connectivity, and those typically score lower as tier 4 projects, lower than the sediment source or sediment transport projects. Why should we care about these lower ranking priority cross-shore connectivity type of projects? Well, these are the ones that are in areas of no appreciable drift, and because they aren't contributing sediment to the drift cell, they score lower than the sediment source or transport projects. And they're also typically in lower energy places with lower banks, which make them, less risky and simpler in a way to design and build. So that makes them great shore-friendly candidates. And I would argue that, these projects do add to the portfolio. Neighbors and friends can see the work on the ground, see what these projects look like, and they help to get more people interested in possible alternatives.
Christina, you're at 1 minute.
Okay, great. So my main takeaway from looking back on this list of shore-friendly projects and how they rank with the tool is that our opportunistic approach is working, but and all in all, we are doing projects that rank as tier 4, and cumulatively they add to an increase in the nearshore health. But that said, we can do better, and by diversifying our approach and adding some targeted strategies, we can try to capture some of those higher priority projects. Like they say, don't put all your eggs in one basket. And then this still leads me to ask, though, how exactly are we going to do this? How do we implement a more diversified approach to project selection? And how do we make the bridge between the science and a voluntary program like Shore Friendly? But I'm excited that this week's summit has so many different disciplines, and the crosstalk between the social scientists and the practitioners can help to start brainstorming some of these ideas. So with that, thank you very much to all our sponsors, partners, and our participating waterfront landowners. And really a special thanks to ESRP for funding Shore Friendly and being such a great advocate for our work. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Christina. Great perspective from the Kitsap area. Jenna, do we have any questions?
I'm not seeing any in there. Folks, feel free to, oh, here comes one from Brandy. Would you share a link in the chat for your tool?
Definitely, most definitely. And we also have an online map viewer, so that is also very helpful. You can see the specific components of the project.
Okay, thanks. I'm not seeing anything else. Oh, here comes one from Ian. Christina, it seems that Colin had a very different sort of takeaway message regarding project selection. Can you comment on your take on those possibly conflicting messages?
Well, I actually agree with Colin in that I see the importance in the opportunistic side of the projects. That's really, I'm just saying that when we have an interested landowner, we should take advantage of that, and those tier 4 projects are important. But we can also build on trying to make those projects larger and capturing more of a neighborhood reach. And I think, so in addition to the opportunistic side of it, I think we should also be exploring how we can do more of a targeted outreach to those higher priority projects. I feel like our tool is underutilized, and we should really, we should try and find, I don't know, different creative ways to get to that, that piece of the pie as well.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Christina. And thank you to all the speakers this morning. Those were really great, engaging talks. And to all the participants, the Q&A part has been really fun. So keep those questions coming. We are on break now. We'll be back at 10:45 with Tina Whitman. We have 5 speakers after break. And while you're on break, Tish, do you want to give an intro to our lounge area where you can interact with people?
Yes. Let's see. I've got too many things up here. Okay. Before I tell you about the lounge, I just wanted to say, wow, thank you so much, speakers, this morning. This is just amazing to see everything coming together and to see all of these amazing talks. Just really huge kudos to everybody. Super inspiring. Okay, so the lounge is a way for everyone to informally interact, and we really wanted to try to emulate perhaps the experience of the hallway in a conference. So what this will do is you'll click on the link, and I think we can get that into the Q&A or the chat. And what you'll do is you'll go to that link, and you'll need to turn off, if you're going to come back to the next session, which you absolutely should. You just have to turn off your video. If you have that option, make sure you turn it off, and then you can go to Wonder uninhibited. And so it'll take a quick picture of you, and that will become your avatar. And what you'll be able to do is move your avatar next to someone else's avatar, and it will open a spontaneous video chat with that person. Other people can come join you, and then you'll have a multi-way chat. You can keep your eye on the other little clusters of chats or other people. So if there's a speaker that you're like, I didn't want to ask the question in front of all of these people, I just want to go have a chat with that person, you can find their avatar and do that. So we as organizers are not facilitating, orchestrating, recording this in any way. We're just wanting to give people a space to interact and connect. So have fun.
Hi all, welcome back. I hope those of you in the lounge had a good time. And yeah, modern technology, huh? Amazing. So we have 5 speakers coming up here before lunch. And starting off will be Tina talking about, the San Juans, I assume, but I don't really know. So Tina, whenever you are ready, kick on in.
All right, great. Thanks, Jason. So I'm Tina Whitman with Friends of the San Juans. It's been really exciting, although I admit to some Zoom fatigue this year, but it's been super exciting to hear from you all and see all this great work that's been happening over the last couple of days. And I'm really excited to see you all in person soon. So I'm going to talk today. I've been with Friends of the San Juans for 19 years, and I lead our shoreline research, restoration, and protection projects. At Friends, we don't just do shorelines, and we use a combination of science, policy and law, and citizen engagement, kind of in all the work to inform all the work we do. So really all this kind of cross-disciplinary presentations have been great and really informative. And I'm going to do kind of the same thing today with crossing things. And I am not successfully advancing my slides. It's worked fine in the test yesterday.
Sometimes you have to have your little mouse over the slide itself.
Okay, so cursor in the middle. Oh, there we go. Okay. So at Friends, we've been involved over the years in a lot of different prioritizations at the parcel, shore form, and landscape scale, and also a lot of actual habitat restoration projects. Mostly armor removals, mostly focused on forage fish spawning habitats, but some wetland reconnections, some creosote removals, some shoreline riparian revegetations. So today, even though sort of our theme is beach restoration, right? I'm actually not going to talk about any of our restoration projects. But I did want to let you know that we just updated our website for this, and you can get to it right on the latest news on our website. Lots of information is there, pre and post photos, videos, information on partners, funders. So you can get all that great information there. I'm happy to talk about those at any time. But really my theme today, I guess, of my talk is really that effective restoration. requires more than just restoration. So for people who know me or have sat next to me at a conference, you will know that this is sort of my little mantra that I always bring to the conversation, is that, you know, without habitat protection, all we're really doing is creating, you know, more job security for restoration practitioners. We've got to work on this side of the puzzle. And it's true that there's regional differences in, you know, how much opportunity there is for habitat protection and all those sorts of things. But I think just as a fundamental kind of underlying theme, we have got to give the protection side of the coin the same amount of attention that sort of the research and the more sexy, I guess, sort of bring a heavy equipment to the beach restoration side is getting. And when I talk about protection, I have, you know, a really broad definition of that. So I'm talking sort of those traditional projects, right? Like an acquisition or an easement that might roll through, you know, a surfboard or ESRP process, but also regulatory protection, reducing demand for armor, for new armor. That's a form, kind of increasing stewardship. That's a form of protection. Land use policies, technical support, and kind of our broader human communities, right? And what's driving these impacts in the first place. So part of why it's so important to prioritize protection, like upfront right now, leverage all the sort of attention that we can get on it and funding, is that the available intact places to protect gets smaller every single day, right? And the places to restore gets bigger every day. So we sort of have to, you know, really leverage, scale up and make an effort. And these two photos are both from Mud Bay on Lopez Island. They're, you know, less than 1,000 feet away from each other. The top photo is a recent conservation easement where 800 feet of feeder bluff with surf smelt and sand lance spawning and herring spawning offshore was permanently protected by a conservation easement. And the bottom one is this new structure that was built without a permit by the landowners this winter. Same habitat type, and you can see it's obviously out over the beach. So one of the struggles that we have actually, and here in the San Juan's protection, is sort of accurately identified as our top salmon recovery strategy. We run into problems at the regional level a lot with sort of, you know, concerns with the protection is too expensive. You know, and I just want to remind us that it's the only permanent thing that any of us do. You know, we do these armor removals and there's a 10-year agreement with the Salmon Recovery Board. And I will say we've tested sort of how those agreements hold up in a terrible case where people went in and re-armored after armor had been removed. And, you know, the funders, that not much happened. So again, making this case for protection. I also think, you know, if we don't prioritize it among our own community, sort of how can we be asking sort of the general public or private landowners to really make that a goal on their sites if it's not really an integrated and really high visible priority goal for us. And then you can think about protection again much more broadly, right? Even if we had all the money in the world, we're not going to be able to do easements or acquisition projects everywhere. And Amy had some great stats on sort of how, you know, how much shoreline property is owned by individual residential landowners, right? And we all know that that's a huge constituency for us. And the San Juans, over 90% of our tax parcels are private residential waterfront owners. But again, getting at this protection piece is these upland development issues of where's the house located, what are the drainage issues, and vegetation removal are really driving armor. And while we have a lot of programs to take out armor, we're just seeing the very first little bits of work through Shore Friendly, really, of trying to address some of these other issues. And those are the bigger, you know, systematic issues that are again driving the armor that we then have to use public funding to try to take out. So I also think, and it's great to hear over the last couple of days that we're sort of, you know, everyone's on the same page here. I'm obviously speaking to the choir, but we have got to be thinking about climate impacts and the increased population that's coming to our area. Because if we think demand for armor was high before, I think we're in for a ride here. It's going to get much, much worse. And are we ready for that, right? What is the strategy? And then the elephant in the room, right, is regulatory protection. So I think we all can sort of acknowledge that the complicated legal framework is basically trying to sort of slow or minimize, but is basically authorizing incremental impacts to shorelines over time, right? That's just reality. And I do wish that some of those trends that we're seeing, when you look at sort of the state armor indicator with the partnership, I wish that those were true everywhere. Colin asked a good question yesterday. Is anyone looking on the ground at conditions and not just at permits, except King County and in San Juan County with Friends work? And because what we're finding, I'll let you know that for the last 10 years, we documented nearly 2 miles of new armor and a 1/4 mile of armor that had been removed that happened from 2009 to 2019. And a lot of that armor is not permitted, so you don't see that if you just track the permit record. Let's see. So one of the constraints to sort of improved regulatory protection, and I'm super excited to say that this has gotten so much better over the last decade. So, 15, 20 years ago, we'd be in there sort of arguing about armor impacts or intertidal beach and all those things. And the work that Megan and Jason and Hannah and so many others have done have really made, sort of the really talking in a reasonable way about sort of minimizing and avoiding impacts in that regulatory process so much better. But that's mostly been up on beaches. So there's sort of, we were asked as part of this conference proceedings to think about sort of what are some of the data gaps and where do we need more research. And I would say that this applied research, right, connecting the land use actions with the impacts. So what about all of our understory kelps? We have virtually no data to really talk about that in the regulatory realm. We see projects where people are authorizing new large overwater structures and their mitigation is taking out Scotch brim on the bluff a 1/4 mile away, right? So Scotch brim is not obviously providing the same services as bull kelp or understory kelps or eelgrass, but we are still pretty limited in the data for our region in some of those areas. So that would be sort of a key data need. And again, other folks have alluded to it, but sort of these climate impacts and really thinking about these projects in terms of resiliency and long-term effectiveness. We see a lot of armor going in right now in response, to sort of short-term events. And is that armor really the right solution for the long-term for that property? And again, so many of you are all working on this, so that's super exciting. I think we just need more models and more data and more examples of on-the-ground alternatives, such as relocating houses.
Tina, you're at 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you. The other thing, right, is so right now the world is pretty small of kind of the people that are working on this topic and are sort of our waterfront landowners, right? And we just have to get more people involved. It's not just the waterfront landowners who care about healthy shorelines, resilient shorelines, healthy marine food webs. Here in San Juan County, our economy is based on our environment and especially the shorelines being healthy. So how do we bring more people along for the ride? And I guess one way to do that, right, one way to get more people involved is to have these projects not be so Chinook salmon focused. Let's have projects that help people too. And this is some of our largest opportunity, right? Infrastructure projects. So this is a chance, instead of going little piano key parcel by piano key parcel, working, and these are big and they're expensive and they're complicated and they're going to require that we sort of change how we think about our funding models and how we restrict certain funds for certain things. And there's a lot more trade-offs and it takes longer, but the payoff is better. And it's also a way of having restoration not be sort of this over on the side salmon recovery action, but it's part of just communities. And as you can see from this photo, like sea level rise is a threat, right? But it's also a huge opportunity. This is a site that actually is a herring sand lance and eelgrass and surf spawning site and a wetland behind there, and obviously a county road. So there's opportunity here to really scale up. So in conclusion, I guess just sort of really thinking about how do we make all of our work on beach science, social science, and restoration more successful, help leverage all of this. Kind of the key themes that I think about are really focusing on protection. What are we doing to address demand for new impacts? Needing some better applied science, and again, we're getting there. Projects that benefit people, and those are going to really be these government projects, right? So one of the things, you know, and this is really changing in our community right now too, but for years, you know, we're asking shoreline property owners to sort of take this risk and take out armoring and do all these things, yet every county road is lined with riprap, right? The county infrastructure is most of the tide barriers, all those kind of things. So I think if we can find those projects where government is really leading and they're really public benefit projects that are larger than just salmon, that'll be another way of sort of thinking about how we get more people involved and make this more sustainable and less of a siloed salmon recovery task. Although we all care about the salmon, right? So I'll leave you with that great picture. So thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Tina. And let's go to one question here. And while we're doing that, Ian, if you want to start sharing your screen, that would be great.
Oh yeah, let me stop share.
Okay, Hugo asks, are you taking into consideration the Puget Sound kelp conservation and recovery plan? They have included 6 recommendations to protect kelp.
Yeah, great question. So that is a great new tool, but it is also just the bull kelp, right? So we're not so clearly defining, and I know there's a little bit of the other kelps covered in there, but that's just a big data gap in terms of talking about the impacts. But yeah, again, we're putting these pieces together, but not all totally there yet.
Okay. That was the only question. There's a couple of great comments. Good presentation.
Great, thanks so much, Tina. Let's move on to Ian. And again, keep typing the questions in because Tina or any of the presenters can type in a response as we move forward. So Ian, take it away.
Okay, can you guys hear me okay?
Yep, all good.
All right. So yeah, my name's Ian Miller, and I am Coastal Hazard Specialist is my title for Washington Sea Grant. I'm also a proponent and practitioner of what you can call quantitative geomorphology, focused on coastlines, which is, you know, basically a data-driven approach for assessing landscape change. And you might say to yourself, hey, that sounds a lot like just science, which it is, except that it is a surprisingly new thing in the realm of geomorphology. So also let me note that it's not the 10th of March, as my slide implies. All you probably know that. It is the 11th. What I've prepared for you today is really just mostly sort of some thoughts about the limitations of the conceptual models we have available to us to help us understand the expected response of the morphology of the shoreline to any variety of kind of alterations or perturbations. And when I say morphology, I'm referring kind of specifically to the shape of beaches and their position over time, and their substrate or grain size over time as well. And I was thinking broadly when I was preparing this talk on being able to predict a response to perturbations in general. So that could be something like armor removal or nourishment or groin removal, as are described in 𝗂𝗵𝗁𝗁 et al. But it also goes beyond that to include sediment flux changes from creeks and rivers, storm-driven erosion or nourishment, slides and erosion from bluffs, or changes to forcings on beaches driven by climate change. So kind of a much broader set of potential dials to turn on beaches than are described in 𝗂𝗵𝗁𝗁 et al. And at the end, I offer my take on what we need to do to progress from my standpoint. Oh, by the way, this photo on here of 𝗕 with this complex conceptual model in his brain is going to come back in a second. So I just wanted to note that. Are my slides advancing? No. There we go. Okay, so so I was thinking again beyond the conceptual models in 𝗬𝗪 et al. And focusing on models that can inform, for a given perturbation, where, how much, and how quickly can you expect a response on the shoreline. And the fundamental problem statement for this talk is this. If you're someone interested in trying to predict how a shoreline may change in response to some alteration or perturbation, if you're not trained in coastal geology and your name is not Jim or Hugh or George or Jessica or many of others of you that are sort of on this call or in this meeting, then largely what you have access to is what you see on the screen here, which are the drift cell mapping arrows that have been around, well, that are based on work published in the 1970s and the 1980s. And the question we need to ask is this all we need to know about processes? And my answer, as I'm guessing that you've figured out, is that we can and should do better to support, the myriad management concerns associated with sea shorelines, not only restoration, but just management in general. So first off, let me just say that these arrows, and that's how I'm going to refer to the drift cell mapping, do provide us with some useful insights about shorelines and how they respond or should be expected to respond given certain perturbations. This, for example, is a photo comparison of a section of beach on Eddy's Hook in the Strait, showing deposition associated with sediment from the 𝗪𝗏 dam removal between 2017 and 2018. So this is a site about 9 kilometers from the 𝗪𝗏 river mouth. It took about 9 years for this kind of sediment perturbation, or for the sediment to reach this particular spot. What I'm going to focus on for the next 6 slides, though, are a variety of case studies that illustrate the limitations of these arrows. And I'm guessing that this isn't going to be new for many of you. So first of all, these arrows, of course, don't tell us anything useful about variable transport rates. So places where transport rates are different on different shorelines, or transport capacities, in a way that would allow us to develop sediment budgets. To illustrate that, what I'm showing you here is a sediment budget I put together for the Morse Creek estuary and mouth at the request of a group of restoration practitioners who found that they needed to address some review concerns associated with the drift cell mapping at this site, and specifically the fact that the shoreline to the west of here was armored. And reviewers were concerned that there wouldn't be any sediment delivery to the estuary where the restoration was focused to provide material to build the hoped-for morphology. So a more nuanced budget for this site, which included an estimate of the fluvial sediment delivery and an estimate of the rate of alongshore transport from the armored shoreline to the west, suggested a different interpretation. And that was that the estuary morphology is very likely more controlled by sediment delivery from the creek, not by alongshore transport. Now, let me also mention before I go further, I sort of put some slides up here. I know that it's hard to sort of read the details, but I think I'm just throwing these up here as examples. So the fine text is kind of less important, although I'm happy to follow up with anyone afterwards if there's interest. The arrows, the drift cell mapping arrows might also lead one to conclude that sediment delivered to the beach moves primarily along the beach, whereas the evidence from a few locations suggests quite the opposite. And we've seen some of that evidence actually presented in this summit as well. This particular example that I'm showing you is from 𝗪𝗏, where we did do some sediment budget work. And we found that only a very tiny fraction of the sediment delivered by the river is entrained into the alongshore or littoral transport system, something on the order of 4% of the total. And a forthcoming, so lest you look at this and say, well, river, this is a river, maybe it's different for another source of sediment like a bluff. Forthcoming analysis from the Ledgewood slide suggests essentially the same. There we found we could find about 9% of the sediment eroded from the toe of that slide on the adjacent beaches. The arrows also, of course, don't provide us any insight about the expected spatial footprint of deposition for a given source of sediment to the beach. This example, the map here is from Ledgewood on Whidbey Island, where we found that we could detect a nourishment signal on the beach, again, from this the erosion of a landslide toe, only about 100 meters, both updrift and downdrift from that massive sediment source. So this one's kind of been alluded to in some the previous talks about the Snohomish restoration, but the arrows tell us nothing about the expected temporal persistence of sediment delivered to the beach. So these photos are from monitoring of a nourishment project that was done by the lower 𝗷𝗏 tribe. This is also on Eddy's Hook, but on the inside of the hook. So on the harbor side. And that project was motivated partially by a desire to improve habitat suitability for forage fish spawning. And one of the key questions going into the project was, if we go through all this trouble to nourish and move this sediment, place it, et cetera, how long is it going to last? What's our benefit, what's our sort of temporal benefit going to look like? And there was really kind of no way to assess that, which led to the monitoring project. And of course, the arrows also ignore, some really important and dominant pathways with sediment movement and deposition on Salish Sea shorelines. This example that I'm showing you here is again from Eddy's Hook and focuses on the movement of sediment after the placement of nourished material on the upper intertidal. So in that particular case, nourishment was placed high up in the intertidal and then allowed to sort of naturally erode and distribute. The box plot that you see here summarizes grain size changes. So these are mean grain sizes, both before and after that nourishment in the low intertidal. This is below mean low water after the project occurred. And this is for a site a little bit outside of the nourishment area. And it suggests that sediment moved rapidly down the beach and deposited in the lower intertidal and even in the upper subtidal. We weren't monitoring the upper subtidal, but just based on observations. We also believe that nourishment, again, placed on the upper beach may have, actually significantly nourished the lower subtidal and ended up improving conditions for subsequent eelgrass transplants that were conducted by the lower 𝗷𝗏 tribe and PNNL. So I included this photo here from that eelgrass transplant project, which to me offers up an interesting new strategy in some circumstances to support eelgrass restoration in Puget Sound. And this also, after George's talk yesterday, Helen was asking questions about, hey, how do we start to figure out subtidal sediment transport processes? So this provided some interesting insights about those possibilities.
Ian, you're at 2 minutes.
Thank you. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, we expect that shorelines might evolve in complex ways as sea level rises, but those arrows really don't provide us with adequate insight about what to expect. This is the map I throw up here is an analysis that I was involved with for Point Julia, where we actually found that we thought we might be able to see a sea level rise, a response in Point Julia. This is on the Port 𝗵𝗵𝘁 tribe reservation, to sea level rise, which was associated with vegetation moving landward. But we couldn't see any sort of change in the volume of Point Julia, which you might expect if you were using those arrows to drive your conceptual model of sea level rise driven change. So how do we get from where we currently are to somewhere better? Well, I outline a 3-step plan that's effectively equivalent to other frameworks that are out there, including the one that Tish laid out at the beginning, this learn, reassess, apply cycle. Basically, we need more measurements on the shoreline made with higher frequency and more accuracy at more places. So the photo here is Heather from the CMAP program, making high accuracy measurements in this case on the 𝗷𝗏. And also to illustrate, I included a snip of the map from the NANUS website. This is the shoreline and beach change tool. And those dots there represent places where you can click on and find shoreline change data. And hopefully you will note, as I've noted many times, that there are no circles north of Point Grenville on the coast. So that sort of highlights the absence of these sorts of data. We need to couple that with rapid data publishing and accessibility. So try to figure out a way not to have these data and the insights associated with them trapped in people's hard drives or in people's brains. And then third, we couple that sort of rapid accessibility with some sort of process, workshop process most likely, to derive shared insights from those available data to hopefully come up with updated and accessible conceptual, or better yet, quantitative models associated with coastal processes. So I've repeated those key takeaways here in writing. Also included my email down there for follow-up, which I would value. And that's it. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Ian. And let's move right into a question.
Good. Okay, we've got a three-part question here from Jim. Jim says that he agrees with that we have a lot to document still here. You mentioned that the signal on the beach north of the Ledgewood slide on Whidbey was only visible for about 100 meters north. How far north did the monitoring extend and how robust was it? That's one part. Did it capture if the sediment was on the beach further north at some time? Maybe two parts, I guess.
So I think our farthest, we just used profiles and grain size to assess that. And that was only after, I think our monitoring was only, I think, 3 years after the event. I'd have to look again. But it was, so really we had to see a change bigger than our detectability limit for the profiles, which was probably around 10 centimeters in terms of vertical change. And I think the farthest north profile was on the order of 250 meters north. I'd have to look though, Jim, to be honest.
And then we've got a question from Hugh. Says, ultimately, how do we get more geologists and geologic research into the 𝗂𝗄𝐶 restoration picture?
Well, I was hoping, Hugh, you were going to help answer that question. I don't necessarily know. I think that, really what I was thinking when I was putting this together was really just trying to, I feel like sometimes in review processes for funding associated with the restoration or other sources, right? I feel like some of these physical processes are often not given the importance that I think they deserve. So I think my hope here was to sort of make that message to as large an audience as possible, in the hopes that when they're involved in review processes for funding proposals or projects, they'll sort of remember those physical processes. That'll be a start.
Okay, and we've got one more. I think we have 1 minute. George says, can you comment on learning from restoration projects versus natural systems with regard to sediment supply and scale?
Well, I think that, I think the whole sort of framework in which I was thinking and delivering the talk was the notion of using restoration projects as an example of a perturbation. And I think that's very useful, right? That's what I've done in most of these instances that I've shown here. I think the other way we can go about this work is to use more model-derived processes, right? Get a better sense for wave energy fluxes to the shoreline, other processes that drive sediment transport, derived from modeling, and then incorporate what we know, models associated with sediment transport. So that's the other way to go about it. That's not associated with actually tracking perturbations on the shoreline, but certainly being able to use restorations as an example of a perturbation and understand the sediment response and associated with those, I think is a useful approach in a lot of cases.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Ian. And as you started out with, you got the George, Jim, Hugh, Jessica.
I know.
Comments there.
Oh.
Okay. You reached all of us though. Great talk. Thank you. And let's stay out around the strait and merge into Jamie here. Take it away, Jamie. And perhaps you're still muted.
Okay, there we go. Can you see my slides and see and hear me?
You're all good.
Okay, great. Well, I'm going to talk about the largest watershed restoration project by dam removal to date, and the connection to 3/4 mile of shoreline restoration, which ultimately yielded what became once an ecosystem restoration opportunity. So we're here looking in the slide here. If you can see my pointer at the 𝗷𝗏 River entering the Strait of Juan de Fuca, the dominant drift energy pushing sediments to the east, with the sediment build out at the river's mouth, which came from the dam removal. And then most of the project area that I'm talking about is here about a mile east of the river's mouth. So moving on, how do I get to the next slide? There we go. Okay. In 2015, the final completion of the dam removal was completed by the National Park Service. The removal of these two dams on the 𝗷𝗚 River have been advocated for by the lower 𝗷𝗚 tribe for generations to restore salmon populations. And these are just some images of the dams breached and then their approximate locations in the watershed. And the 𝗷𝗚 is largely a wilderness watershed that had legendary historic salmon populations that were nearly extirpated as a result of the dams. They're beginning to round the corner and come back. But this project really is focusing on some of the nearshore impacts associated with restoration opportunities made possible by that dam removal. So I'll just briefly touch on some of the effects that, adverse effects that dams have on the nearshore. I think this is probably fairly well understood, but obviously the dams trap sediment and woody debris within the watershed, coarsening the lower river and the nearshore, changing the flood regime and frequency of coastal habitats, ultimately coarsens beaches, changes both trophic cascades and plant and animal communities. So stepping back to sort of what this shoreline looked like prior to the installation of the dams, this is a 1908 image of the 𝗷𝗚 nearshore, and we see a river channel exiting the strait in approximately the same location as it is today, with some estuary to the west, and then extending east was an intertidal lagoon more than a mile long that was protected by a large sand spit. And as you can imagine, the starvation of river sediment to the system resulted in quite rapid erosion of the sand spit. And moving up to 1956, so this is, approximately, 30 plus years following the implementation of the dams, we see that lagoon has disconnected from the river's mouth here. And we now have a large lake that exists along the shoreline here. But as of the 1950s, there was already concern over erosion and the potential for disappearance of that lagoon that had now become a lake. And so practices of that era were to defend a shoreline configuration. Extending forward another 60 years to 2011, so this is right before dam removal began, you can see that lake is now gone. The legacy of that lake and the management of that shoreline was a long 3/4 mile run of armor that had been placed out to defend and protect that lake feature. Much of this had eroded out. A fair bit of it was littered across the tidelands, with some portion of it being shore attached as well. So thinking about this in the context of dam removal and the liberation of a century's worth of sediment, this really hadn't been done at this scale before, and it wasn't clear where or how that sediment would wind up being transported, where it would land. We saw a massive build out of the river delta extending, prograding about a half mile into the Strait of 𝗲𝗏, a half kilometer, and then about a kilometer to the east. So really dramatic evolution. As time has proceeded forward, we've begun to see that the sort of slug of sediment coming through the watershed as a result of dam removal has lessened. The marine energy is beginning to sort of weld and push these delta bars back a little bit more toward land. But in the early stages of the shoreline response to the dam removal, this is a heat map that was produced by U.S. Geological Survey. And for those of you who are familiar with the vicinity here, the freshwater bay shoreline is completely unarmored. Then we have the river delta here. And this is a heat map of yellow to maroon being deposition in meters and vertical. So we're looking at a greater than 5 meter vertical increase of surface elevation along much of the delta, some of the shoreline here. But then extending east along the shoreline, we see a pattern of blue, which continues to be chronic erosion with some offshore deposition. But it just appeared that this material was not making it onto the shoreline here. And we began to wonder if that may have been associated with that 3/4 mile run of armor that had protected that prior lake feature that had eroded out. So again, this is what the beach looked like. And our theories were that this material, some of it being 6-8 foot diameter riprap boulders, the size of a refrigerator or larger, about 30 feet wide along this beach, running for well over a half mile in the intertidal, and then almost a 1/4 mile of shore attached, was deflecting beach building materials, whether it was sand, gravel, cobble, rejecting the deposition of large woody debris, and of course having a physical impact and a habitat impact. So looking at what was the control sort of reference area on the freshwater bay shoreline to the west of the river's mouth, we saw a very immediate broadening and fining of the beach following dam removal. Whereas on the eastern shoreline at the vicinity of Beach Lake, we saw just littered with rubble, very little deposition. It was unclear if it was just going to take more time for that material to get there, or if this armor was truly an impediment to that physical process. But we made the case to the Salmon Recovery Funding Board, the Estuary and Salmon Restoration Program, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And fortunately, all of those entities were able to get funding to us quickly, that we were able to respond while the sediments that were made available by dam removal were still moving through the system. And this is the aerial of what it looked like prior to mobilization to remove that failed armor. So we see the massive build out of the river mouth, and then the approximate location of where that armor was in the intertidal and along the shoreline. So why it's significant is that that sediment starvation resulted in the loss of the estuarine lagoon, the shoreline transition from sand and gravel to cobble and boulder, and the derelict armor was creating great perches for predators to hang out, and it really wasn't suitable habitat for rearing, spawning, foraging, migrating salmonids and forage fish. So beginning in 2016, we mobilized out onto the shoreline with heavy equipment and began to dismantle this failed seawall, retrieving material from across the tidelands. And we did about a half mile in 2016. We have done 13 additional mobilizations to retrieve material that has emerged from this beach. If we think about the shoreline, it was chronically eroding for decades, and there were measures to defend it that had failed over and over again, and that became buried within the beach. And so when it reemerged at a process impeding scale, we had the funding capacity to go back out and remove and retrieve it. What's interesting is that we had a neighbor next door who had a violation for unpermitted shoreline armor placement, and we invited them to join in our restoration effort. And in 2016, they were not interested. By 2017, they saw the transformation of our beach, and we extended our permit to cover their shoreline. They paid the ticket to resolve their violation. But this was fairly immediate following the removal of the material, where almost overnight, in one tidal cycle, we saw about a 10-foot vertical increase in beach surface with a 20 to 30-foot horizontal expansion of beach profile. A significant wood deposition was beginning to occur, and this has continued to date, with the process really being able to repair itself with position being possible. We of course did see material that emerged from the beach, and we had the capacity to go back out and retrieve that. And so we've done that 14 times to date, just about every month of the year. Low tide occurs at some really interesting hours and times of day, depending upon the month. So we've seen beautiful sunrises. We've been working in the dark. We made a small mountain of riprap that was retrieved off of the beach, and a really incredible transformation has occurred. We've continued to monitor for newly emerged armor, and then conduct a suite of biophysical metrics. And what I like to point out here is our surf smelt spawn sampling in 2016 pre-project. Then we moved 2018, same sampler, same location, very different beach.
Jamie, you're at 2 minutes.
Okay, great. Looking at beach profile in Freshwater Bay, this is our reference sort of control area that had no restoration. So we see a small signal of beach build out, which was associated with the continued delivery of beach building material from the river. But then when we look to the project area where the armor was removed, we see in this intertidal armor stretch, we have a significantly larger deposition of material across the entire beach profile. In the area where we had the shore attached armor removed, we see a reduction in the upper beach, which was the removal of the armor, but then a broadening and flattening of the intertidal beach. And then most notably was down drift, where we saw the most significant vertical and horizontal gain in beach profile. And I think what that may have been is that this entire 3/4 mile run wound up deflecting beach building material out to deeper water, and it didn't make it to the adjacent shoreline to travel down through the drift process. So back in the napkin calculation, we saw about a 6-to-1 in removed 1 unit of armor from the beach, received 6 units of beach building material as a result of the dam removal and the sediment material that was made available. We saw an increase in abundance and diversity of inverts, and then we saw a range expansion of surf smelt. So looking at the drift cell prior to dam removal, very limited location in the western drift cell. Then following dam removal, we saw an expansion in the western drift cell as those beaches fined, but it wasn't until we saw the armor removal that we got spawning at the project site and then extending east multiple miles within the drift cell. So the synopsis here is that nearshore ecosystem restoration associated with large-scale dam removals is incomplete until hydrodynamic disrupting features along the shoreline are fully resolved and at the process scale. Once those impediments are removed, the restoration of the physical process can be rapid, but the ecosystem scale life history of the restoration of fish, plants, inverts, etc. Takes more time, but we're beginning to see positive responses for large woody debris, benthos, and forage fish. And although not every project has a legacy scale sediment delivery of a dam removal, it is really important to consider the drift cell scale sediment process when doing shoreline restoration and look at preserving or protecting any key updrift contributors, whether they be feeder bluffs or other sources. And then, of course, coordinating and implementing projects that may potentially have synergistic benefits. So with that, I'd like to thank all of our collaborators and partners and take questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Jamie. And we have time. Let's do one question. And then while we're doing that, DG, if you could start sharing your screen, please.
Okay, I think this is a really fast one we might be able to get to too. So Kathleen just asked a clarifying question. Was that 10,000 cubic yards or 100,000 of debris removed?
10,000.
10,000, okay. And so a slightly longer one is from Megan. So the mechanism here is wave and log reflection off those relic riprap boulders, excuse me.
That's what we've surmised was the physical process interference. We certainly don't have a sort of a bench model that we scaled to study it at, but that seemed like that was the physical process impediment that was occurring.
Is that all the time we have?
Yeah, we should move on. Thanks so much, Jamie. And there's another question or two in the Q&A, so feel free to type a response to those. Would be great.
Bet. Yeah, thanks everyone.
All right, thanks. And DG, looks like you're getting going here. If you're sharing, we can see your notes, so you might want to switch that display setting.
Let's try a different way then. Stop sharing. Okay, how does that look?
It looks good. You aren't in the full. You could try going to display settings if you see that on the top of that when you're sharing.
Let's see. So I've slideshow.
If you go to slideshow again, there's usually.
Oh, use presenter view. Okay, I'll stop that. And let's try this. How about now?
Oh, looks great. You're in.
Does it?
So
Does
go
it look
for it.
okay?
Yep, you're on.
All righty. Okay, thanks very much, Jason, and all the presenters this morning. Really great to hear what all the work that's being done, and to share a little bit about what we've been doing in British Columbia and across Canada after spending a whole bunch of money, and how we can use green shores as a multi-pronged tool in the coastal resilience toolbox. So this is an image of a Green Shores for Homes project, which was completed in 2018. And it's really a good example of the success of Green Shores in British Columbia. But it wasn't always that way. So cue some sappy music. Basically, over the past 10 years, over $1 million has been spent in research and development to develop guidance for shoreline projects. However, we found that having really great guidance was not enough. And this is sort of building on what the previous speakers had said, because we all know that developing best practices and guidance doesn't get translated into action. What we really need is this multi-pronged approach. So for Green Shores, that approach includes obviously solid guidance and what we want to see in terms of shoreline projects. We need to support our local governments, and we do that through a working group in British Columbia. We need to offer training to both to homeowners, professionals, contractors, and local governments. We also offer a project certification process similar to LEED, sort of like LEED, like the shoreline. And then finally, we are developing a registry of approved professionals in Green Shores, as well as a community of practice. So let's back up a bit. What the heck is Green Shores? So Green Shores basically came about from a coastal stewardship guide that was developed in the late 1990s. And in that guide, it outlined the key points and aspects of stewardship for BC coasts. It was launched through a series of workshops, and but the feedback from those workshops is like, well, this is all great. The theory looks great. It's good to hear about coastal shore stewardship, but we need some more details. And so the story goes that the workshop leaders were stuck in traffic, in a traffic jam. So they got to talking about, well, what would that look like? And so the idea came about, well, why don't we develop a LEED for the shoreline? And so the Green Shores was then launched. It was 5 years. The original program was 5 years in development for a credit and rating system that was called Green Shores. So Green Shores is basically a rigorous standard based on these 4 guiding principles. We want to preserve and restore shoreline physical processes. So Ian, take note, we really do talk a lot about the physical processes in each project. We also want to maintain or enhance habitat function and diversity. We want to prevent or reduce pollutants from entering the aquatic environment. And so in this case, we are also considering what happens upland in Green Shores. And we also want to avoid or reduce those cumulative impacts. So all Green Shores verified projects must meet these guiding principles, all of them in their projects. So as I mentioned, these credit and ratings guides have been developed as tools so that properties can move forward in a shore-friendly way, and it's consistent with the shore-friendly methods. And so these 2 credit and rating systems are built on a format similar to Built Green or LEED, using the credit and rating system to incentivize more best practices going into each and every project. So we have 2 systems that are available. Green Shores for Shoreline Development, which originally came out in 2010 and was updated in 2020. A shout out to Coastal Geologic Services who led the team on that. And that's for commercial, multifamily residential, subdivision, park and institutional projects. So these are for the larger scale projects. And then Green Shores for Homes, which obviously, as it sounds, focuses on residential properties. And it was developed came out in 2015. It was developed through a US EPA grant for both Washington and BC, and really a unique transborder initiative. So a shout out to Washington for sharing that. In addition to these credit and ratings guides, we really need to support on the ground implementation. So having those guides on the shelf isn't really going to do much. So we talked to a lot of different local governments in British Columbia, and we asked them what they needed, and they said, you know, support would be really great. So we have a virtual meeting once a month, and together we work on community education and engagement, and we share a lot of lessons learned about how nature-based approaches can be implemented using the Green Shores design guidance and framework. We have joint proposals for project work like Green Shores demonstration projects. A lot of peer-to-peer learning going on, particularly around policy development, how we can work together in terms of community engagement as well as planning. And then we get to have fun every once in a while at face-to-face meetings. So another aspect of our program, which really works quite synergistically with the local government group and the guidance, is the Green Shores training. So we've developed a memorandum of understandings, letter of agreements with post-secondary institutions, which gives a lot of credibility to the training at all levels. And we have 3 levels that we offer. The level 1 is the introduction to Green Shores. Level 2 is really focused more on practitioners, and it's the application of the 2 credit and rating systems, how to use them on real projects. And then level 3, which is proficiency in Green Shores. It's our latest course, is just completed its pilot stage. And upon completion of a level 3, the participant can be a Green Shores approved professional. We really are looking at expanding awareness and use of Green Shores right across the board. Another aspect that we have is project certification for both our 2 credit and rating systems. So since 2016, we've had 16 Green Shores for Homes projects that are enrolled in progress, with 8 completed the full verification system. And for the Green Shores for Shoreline Development, we have 7 projects that have enrolled or in progress and 4 that have been completed. Anecdotally, I hear all the time about people who have been using the design guidance but have not enrolled through project verification. And we really do encourage enrollment so that the projects that call themselves Green Shores truly do meet that standard, and because we are aware of greenwashing and we don't want that to happen. Well, you might be asking yourselves, well, why bother with the Green Shores rating? And so it's really about walking the talk and being able to have that accountability and that verification through a third-party process that offers that compelling proof that the project has met those environmental goals. So there's that check right there. And obviously, it's in alignment with a growing number of government policies and regulations. And really also about demonstrating leadership in shoreline stewardship. This photograph is the gal in the middle is a planner with a regional district, and it's her own property, and she really felt it important that she walk the talk. And the same with our local governments. They're really looking at getting all their projects that are on the shore Green Shores certified so they can demonstrate that to their residents. And ultimately, we're seeing with a verification process, there may be some links to incentives in the future. A little bit about the Green Shores approved professionals and community of practice. So we're really looking to expand this, because we have a lot of times where people get in touch with us and say, who do I call? And now that we have this approved professional designation, we can put project proponents in contact with folks that really know how to apply the credit and rating system to design really good projects that are resilient for our shore based on those 4 guiding principles. And ultimately, what we're looking to do is build that network and also have some mentoring of young professionals for those who practice this type of approach. So just
you're at 2 minutes.
Perfect. So here I'd like to just give a couple of examples. This is a Green Shores for Homes project. You can see it's on Vancouver Island. You can see the shoreline erosion. This is the project upon completion. Obviously the plants are quite young, but it was a combination of nourishment and a buried revetment. So that's Green Shores for Homes. Here's a Green Shores for Shoreline Development project. It's here took place in this part of the park in Vancouver. This is the result, Green Shores for Shoreline Development gold rated project. Included a creation of a habitat island, habitat restoration, including a salt marsh, tidal inlets, and daylighting the creek. They did extensive riparian planting on both sides over here. And this, what looks like sort of fish pens, is actually netting to keep the Canada geese away from the newly planted plants. And I will note on the right-hand side, they really did a lot of extensive signage, and part of the Green Shores is to include that educational component. So one of the things that we wanted to know was, what's the impact and how well is this Green Shores program doing? So we hired a consultant to evaluate the program. And what they found was that there's a 7-to-1 net benefit to cost ratio on Green Shores projects. So the Green Shores, the larger scale projects, is what they analyzed. So looking at the ecological benefits, the economic benefits, and the cultural benefits. So that multi-pronged approach we're using in BC really has come up with a net benefit. And so it's really has been really worthwhile. The money indeed was well spent, that $1 million. So by using Green Shores, we can benefit, so we can demonstrate those benefits because we have these verified projects. We can have confidence that using trained professionals, providing support to local government level, as well as having those projects verified. I'm hoping that this will, you'll be able to apply some of these lessons learned about using maybe some aspects of this type of approach in your work. And with that, I'll just have a thank you, and you can get in touch with me there, and happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, DG. That was a really great talk. Let's see, Sydney, if you want to start sharing your screen, and Jenna, do we have any questions?
I don't see any questions yet.
We'll hold a moment, but feel free to type a question in, of course, to the Q&A, because Gigi could type in a response later. And it is 11:45, so we should move on to Sydney, who is our final talk today.
All right.
Sydney, let's move on to you.
Great. Are you seeing my slides and seeing me okay?
Everything looks great.
Excellent. So hi, everyone. My name is Sydney Fishman, and I work for the Washington State Department of Ecology. And today I'm fortunate to be able to follow up a lot of the great presentations because a lot of the work that folks have already touched on today is wrapped up into what I'll be talking about, which is how our department is advancing the implementation of the local shoreline armoring regulations. So today I'll give you a little bit of context and purpose for the work that I did and that I continue to do. And I'll also share a brief overview of some interviews that I conducted in 2019 with local governments, and then talk about some ongoing and recent tools and resources specifically aimed at local jurisdictions that stemmed from those interviews and a lot of the other needs that several of our speakers have identified today. So for a little bit of context, I just want to make sure everyone is familiar with the structure of shoreline management in Washington. This shoreline management is a state and local partnership. And so the local jurisdictions, those being the cities and counties, they have the primary responsibility to develop and implement shoreline regulations through the form of local shoreline master programs, or SMPs. And then the state really plays a supporting role to these local jurisdictions. On a day-to-day basis, this really looks like technical assistance, for example, helping them review and implement projects, or doing ordinary high water mark determinations. But there are also some more formal actions that we take. We do have formal approval of any changes to those local shoreline master programs, and we also have final action on some types of shoreline permits. I also want to frame my work and the work of others at my agency in the context of the implementation strategy, because I think, as our call today and yesterday really pointed to, everyone is filling a piece of the larger puzzle. And so I think the Department of Ecology really fits into the regulatory component. I really work on implementation, but others that I work with, hit all of these buckets: implementation, compliance, enforcement. And I think everyone at Ecology who communicates with local jurisdictions enforces or supports the regulatory strategy. And I think also a lot of the implementation work and the daily grind of implementation of projects really speaks to or provides lessons learned for planning. So as we learn how things are working, how our regulations are going, that informs the longer term planning strategy. Ultimately, long story short, Ecology is increasing its focus on the local implementation of, well, all sorts of things in the shoreline master programs, but today I'll be talking about the shoreline armoring regulations. As many of you may know, over the past, 17 years now, but more recently than that, most jurisdictions around the state have completed a comprehensive update. So that's a complete overhaul of their local shoreline master program. And now that they have this new language in place, the question is, okay, how is it going? How are we living with these regulations? How are they actually being implemented? And so that is really what the increased focus is turning towards. I came to the Department of Ecology in 2018 in a project position to, again, evaluate how the implementation of local armoring regulations was going. And I did that primarily through conducting a series of interviews with local planners. And I will be sharing some of the results with you today that I think are most relevant to this audience. So what did I do? As I mentioned, I conducted 12 interviews in February through May of 2019 with these 12 jurisdictions that obviously have Puget Sound waterfront and had also completed a comprehensive update of their SMP. So they were working with their new regulations. And the goals of my interview were fourfold. First, I wanted to characterize the local processes for reviewing and approving shoreline stabilization. And second, I wanted to document the types of projects that were being seen around Puget Sound. Third, I wanted to capture any challenges and needs related to implementation across the board, and also if there were any differences between project types. So for example, new projects versus emergencies versus repairs and replacements. And finally, I wanted to identify ways that the Department of Ecology could help address those needs. So here are some findings that, again, I think are most relevant to this audience. It should be surprising to no one that the diversity of Puget Sound shorelines and the wide variety of different environments and geological conditions that you might find pose some site-specific constraints and show different conditions that can make designing and approving projects complicated. A second challenge that local jurisdictions highlighted was around code language. As I mentioned, a lot of these shoreline master programs were fairly new. And so now that staff had this language in place, they were learning to live with it. And in some cases, recognizing that perhaps things were written in an unclear manner, or staff were having difficulty implementing the language, which again, as you can imagine, produces a challenge in implementation. A third challenge that I think we can probably all relate to is that things like lack of staff time and capacity, lack of funding, and lack of training presented some internal barriers to how projects were being reviewed. And then these last two, I think, go together. They relate to the knowledge of the folks who are coming in or who are related or involved with project design. So first, those being the applicants. Local jurisdictions frequently reported that applicants simply had a very low understanding of the geomorphic processes of their shoreline, and also didn't really have a good understanding of the alternatives to hard armoring that were available. And then local jurisdictions noted that in terms of the technical professionals, either perhaps they weren't familiar or didn't feel comfortable because they didn't have the training, or for other reasons were not recommending these types of designs to their clients. And so, of course, these applicants are looking to their consultants for expertise, and if they're not hearing the full story, they don't have the information they need to make an informed decision. And that also goes to the fifth point here, reaching people early. By the time folks come into the local permit counter, they've already hired a consultant and done designs and made up their mind. And that's too late in the process to present alternatives to hard armor and really convince someone to change their mind. So some areas for improvement that local jurisdictions noted: one, education for a wide range of audiences. I think I'll just point to what DG was saying about what that training needs to look like. It's not just landowners and consultants, but also real estate agents, and pretty much anyone who interacts with the shoreline needs to have some understanding of what's going on. And then in terms of technical reports, so these would be the geotechnical reports that are developed in support of different shoreline actions. Both on the preparation side, are those reports complete and really getting at what the regulations are looking for in terms of an evaluation of alternatives? And then on the review side, do the local staff have the training that they need to understand what the report is saying and figure out whether it's meeting the code language? But of course, I want to not just dwell on things that are bad. I want to point out some positive takeaways from my interviews. Across the board, it seems, although as Tina was pointing out, there may be some areas where this isn't necessarily the case, but overall, I would say that the local jurisdictions were noting a low amount of armoring, and where action on the shoreline was happening, often in terms of repairs and replacements, these present opportunities to lessen impacts because they're a decision point where you can choose to do something different. And also, finally, the local jurisdictions noted that basically the people on this call are a great resource. There's this growing body of knowledge that can provide a benefit to local jurisdictions. And then what did the local jurisdictions see as opportunities for my agency and the folks who work at the Department of Ecology? Well, first, they noted the technical assistance that we provide is incredibly helpful. And so we definitely need to continue doing that. And then, as I mentioned, in our unique state-local partnership, Ecology is really in the best position to provide guidance on how to improve local code language and processes when there are challenges identified. And then these last two points, I think, go together and speak to partnerships, not only between the state and the local jurisdictions, but also between the local jurisdictions and the many types of people who are represented on this call, who have this body of knowledge that can be shared, resources that can be shared, and partnerships at all stages of the work that local jurisdictions do. The Department of Ecology, I think, is in a great position to foster those relationships because we are in such close communication with the local jurisdictions. So what are some ongoing efforts to try to support these needs and address these implementation challenges? Well, first, I manage a web application that provides examples of soft shore and other kinds of alternatives to armor that have happened around Puget Sound. So this isn't just soft shore, but also projects that avoided, reduced, or removed hard armor. And I currently have 73 projects on the tool. I just updated it on Friday, so I'm always looking for more projects to add. And really the point of this tool was to meet this need that local jurisdictions noted, which is that folks simply don't know that there are alternatives. They may not realize that soft shore is an option. They can't picture what it looks like. And so this tool provides some basic information and photos to try to meet that need.
Sydney, you're at 2 minutes.
Thank you. Additionally, trainings for key audiences. So again, as DG and others have mentioned, more training is a huge need amongst local jurisdictions. And so last year, myself and 𝗂𝗵𝗁 from DFW and 𝗕𝗃𝗵𝗁 from Washington Sea Grant prepared a series of webinars on the marine shoreline design guidelines that took this technical document and translated the key points and provided handouts and resources for folks who are at the permit counter reviewing these projects. And I also want to give a shout out to the NTA project that Nicole and Kathy Angel are working on. I think some information was put in the chat in our morning session, but this NTA is looking at the training needs of not only planners, but also contractors and consultants to try to figure out how we can get a more durable and more targeted training to these different audiences who have a huge influence over what private landowners are doing. And so to wrap up, I really want to tie back to the implementation strategy and call out that all the work that's been highlighted throughout the last couple of days is all the different pieces of a puzzle, right? And so myself and my colleagues fit into some of these areas, and I think the rest of us are building this more complete picture of how we can ultimately try to reduce the impacts of armor and improve the health of our shorelines on Puget Sound. So I just want to say a big thank you to everyone for your attention and also for just the work that you all are doing, because it's together that we're gonna see this progress. And that's all I have.
That is so great. Thank you so much, Sydney. And let's move on to a question.
All right, we've got a couple of long ones in here. First of all, Jennifer Griffiths put some links in about the shoreline armoring implementation strategy. And there's a question from Megan. And I think she's referring to the beginning of your presentation when you're talking about the interviews with the local planners. And Megan, oh boy, and now my screen is going up. Megan asks, would local planners ever admit that they were doing a bad job implementing?
That's a great question. Did they admit to me? No, I don't think. Would they and did think are two different questions. I think the local jurisdictions recognize that there are challenges. Some of those challenges are outside of their control and some of them are within their control. I think local jurisdictions and the staff they recognize that they have a lot of limitations in terms of their training and their capacity and some of the other pressures that they're under. And so while I wouldn't say that, they're just raising their hand and say, we're doing a terrible job, I think the folks that I spoke to want to improve. They want to see conditions improve. They want to see implementation improve. And so they recognize where there are challenges and where ecology themselves, others can try to meet those challenges.
Thanks. And we've got one more question. It's pretty long. So it's from John. And John says, we have seen clearly that there is not a consistent relationship in ecological impacts of various types and locations of shoreline armoring. Currently, most SMPs lack a tool to effectively measure impacts, mitigation, etc. What can ecology bring to the table in terms of defining no net loss as it applies to the nearshore? And what tools can be offered to help applicants and governments understand how to apply the concept of NNL? And then there's a little bit more. I'm going to probably leave it there.
Sure. Yeah, so that's a great question. The issue of no net loss is very complicated, and I wouldn't even say that I'm the expert on it. I would point you or others who are interested to some actually ongoing webinar series that are occurring between Ecology, Department of Fish and Wildlife, and Department of Commerce. We had a whole webinar on shorelines and no net loss. And what I would point to is that I know that my agency, the Department of Ecology, is working on some new guidance around no net loss. And the department, if you are in a local jurisdiction, I think reaching out to your local shoreline planner at Ecology would be one thing to do to help kind of understand that. If you are, I'm not sure what your affiliation is, but I can point you to some of those resources. I see also there was a Q&A about the webinar series, so I can share some of those links to those webinar series and those resources. And then if it is a more in-depth question, I would recommend reaching out to the Ecology Regional Shoreline Planner because unfortunately, I am not a no net loss expert.
Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Sydney. Great wrap-up talk for the day. So let's wrap up. I have two general comments, one for everyone, and that is thank you so much on behalf of the Planning Committee. This has been really fun and lots of great engagement and communication, which is what we were hoping for. So thank you so much to everyone. Next Wednesday, we're starting in on deltas. So if you're in on that, great. If not, you can still register. And if you want to get a hold of any of the speakers today, we do have a program up on the website for the summit hosted by ESRP. So look for people's contact information there if you want to find them. And my next comment is for all the speakers today and panelists. So we do have follow-up breakout discussions with the speakers this afternoon starting at 1. And so that is a separate Zoom link. You should have got an email from Jay titled Nearshore Summit Discussion. And so look for that separate Zoom link that will start up at 1. And that's all I have. Does anyone else on the planning committee have any other comments?
I'll just reiterate the enthusiasm and gratitude to all of our speakers. It's just so fun and wonderful to see the vision of the summit realized in this amazing group of people coming together. And it's really exciting to see the engagement with all of the audience and across the panelists. So just thank you guys all so much for your hard work and participation in this. We're really excited.
Okay, let's take that excitement to lunch. Thank you everyone again, and we hope to see some of you next Wednesday for deltas. Bye-bye.